I'm not going to waste your time with preamble, let's just get on with the video. The game opens in the Undead Asylum. Movement is standard omnidirectional third-person movement seen in many action games. We have the ability to move, light attack, heavy attack, roll, lock on, and sprint as the basic actions that we are introduced to at first. Movement in the game works as well as one would expect. It is no great feat to have functional movement. It is a bare minimum to have well-made and intuitive controls, and unfortunately, Dark Souls 1 has one slight pitfall with its movement system. While locked on, the player character can only roll in 4 cardinal directions. Combat is still functional because enemies and bosses tend to be predictable enough and simple enough that this limitation will not cause the player to die in most cases. It is still an issue though. There are moments, despite being few and far between, where a player can die during fights owing to this design choice, which can be one of the more infuriating aspects of gameplay. A player's death ought to be by their own making, not owing to them having to fight against the controls. This is most noticed when it leads to death by falling into a chasm and, ironically, during the more well-designed bosses in the game such as Ornstein and Smough and Artorias of the Abyss. Skilled players of these games will often roll in specific directions for optimal play against bosses, especially well-made and well-telegraphed ones, and this aspect is hamstrung because of cardinal rolling. An example would be Artorias' spinning slash, which will hit the player with the second slash if they roll in any direction other than backwards. This limitation is the reason why I fight Ornstein and Smough without locking onto either of them. The player still maintains omnidirectional rolling when they are not using the lock-on feature. Speaking of lock-on, it is a staple for most third-person action games. Lock-on allows players to use the buttons on the right-hand side of their controller without needing to control their camera manually, or else they are stuck using the claw hand. Lock-on has the function of locking the camera to automatically focus on the player's chosen enemy, and it doubles as a method for players to aim their attacks without needing to angle their character in the correct direction. Overall, the system works as intended, apart from a few hiccups. Lock-on can fuck up the camera when the player is backed against a wall, close to large enemies, and when enemies zoom past the player character. Camera is tough to nail, and I don't think that a perfect camera system can ever exist in a 3D game with as much going on as there is in Dark Souls. Not to say that issues I mentioned can't be fixed, they can. For Honor proved that hiding terrain when the player is pressed against a wall fixes that specific issue. Zooming out the camera when the player is against larger targets allows the camera to not cause as many issues from the player when they attack those types of enemies up close. Overall though, I won't harp on the camera too much. It works well 95% of the time. For the Souls fans watching this video, you may be curious why I didn't show or mention Ludwig from Bloodborne when I was discussing the camera zoom out as an example of FromSoft learning from their mistakes to make a better boss fight. This video is merely the first of many. I'm going to be tackling every Souls game from Dark Souls 1 onwards with a few exceptions. The goal is to thoroughly critique every well-regarded game in the series while only referencing the games in the series that were released before whichever game I am discussing. Simply put, I will not be referencing future Souls games to make points. Elden Ring's video will sign off on a conclusion on the games and their changes in design as time has gone on. The Asylum continues as the player is face to face with the Asylum Demon, which to the vast majority of new players will be unbeatable using the Broken Straightsword. The goal is to run away to find the correct tools to beat it. The lights placed next to the exit are honestly just a great yet simple feat of level design to attempt to draw the player's eyes to the correct destination without spelling it out unrealistically. This game was made before the discovery of convenient yellow paint. The next area introduces the player to more controls, with the ability to jump, parry, block, two-hand their weapon, kick, and use spells if the player chooses one of the 3 caster archetypes as their starting class. The game also gives us our healing item, the Estus Flask. We'll discuss most of these later when they make more sense as topics to bring up. What we shall discuss now, however, is the plunging attack. We begin the Asylum Demon fight right after learning how to use this ability. The player can press light attack while falling to execute a high damage attack on whichever enemy is directly below the player. It works exactly how one would expect. It can do a tremendous degree of damage as well as having the ability to knock low poise enemies prone when used with a heavy weapon. Allowing the player to attack mid-fall adds a layer to decision making during combat without taking anything away from other aspects of their toolkit. Otherwise, falling would just take control away from players completely. The Asylum Demon specifically takes significant damage from the plunging attack, and that is for a fantastic reason. Dark Souls 1 introduces the player to this formidable creature that one must quickly learn to run from. The broken straight sword tickles the poor creature. The game then allows the player to grab new gear and tells them to face this monster again. One must then use the plunge attack and rid the beast of most of its health with this one attack. This is a great example of guidance. Enemies and challenges in Dark Souls will appear dangerous and formidable in many shapes and sizes. They will test the player on their skill and knowledge of the game's mechanics, but these things are beatable. One can persevere. With a little bit of time and careful attention to items, the world, and the game's mechanics, Dark Souls allows the player to overcome even the greatest of its challenges. A giant evil demon monster wasn't picked as the tutorial boss at random. The Asylum Demon exists as a method of communicating to the player that they can defeat the challenges that the game presents, no matter how fantastical and overbearing they may appear on the surface. This is a fantastic tutorial that not only teaches the player the basics, but also gives a meaningful lesson on the nature of the game's presented challenge as one which is conquerable. The Undead Asylum teaches all of the mechanics that are necessary for completing the game. Even the boulder that opens up Oscar's area can be viewed as part of the tutorial, showing the players the dangers of traversing the world without being observant and careful of the risks of environmental hazards. Firelink Shrine is then opened to the player. This is their hub, for lack of a better term. The crestfallen warrior sits next to the bonfire, indicating that this character is not the player's enemy. This is such a small detail, but the fact that he's sitting down and is non-hostile from the onset is a good way to indicate his passivity towards the player. There was a large amount of consideration by the devs to make sure that the players knew who were NPCs and who were enemies at a glance. From facing away from the player, to sitting down, to being caged up, the devs make a conscious effort not to make players feel cheated by accidentally hitting a friendly character. This coincides with other mechanics, such as damage thresholds for NPCs to aggro, and dialogue responses when hit to prevent players from angering the wrong person by mistake. If a player wants the NPC dead, it must generally be a deliberate attempt by the player, which is why I have an issue with Oswald's ability to forgive the player for angering NPCs. Oswald's ability to restore an NPC's passivity after they've been attacked undercuts the choices that players make concerning NPC aggression. It is incongruent with the design choices previously stated that ensure that NPCs are recognized as such by players. The permanence and importance of choice is a large aspect of Dark Souls 1 overall. This isn't a massive issue or critique, it's more of a preference for permanent consequences. First playthroughs of games are often characterized as the runs where mistakes are made and content is missed. Oswald allows this aspect of a first playthrough to be overwritten, which can rob players of those unique experiences. I hope that the format of this critique is already coming across. I am going through mostly chronologically while bringing up topics as they become emergent, only jumping ahead where necessary. Every topic regarding a system in the game is discussed where most appropriate. The story and soundtrack will be discussed at the end of the chronological breakdown. Right after those elements have been discussed, we will jump into the overarching conclusions on the game as a whole, using all the arguments made in the chronological breakdown as the evidence to assist my statements in that final section. Upon entering Firelink Shrine, the player is also greeted with the text, "In Lordran, level up and kindle bonfires." This is one of the only times that the player is given overt direction outside of the tutorial. Handholding is a topic all on its own that I want to discuss later after we find a certain basement key. Character strengthening mechanics form the basis of progression in any game with RPG elements. They are done in RPGs through a variety of means. Skill trees, loot drops, and level ups are all methods to deliver this process of progress among many variations of systems used across one of, if not the largest genre in gaming. Dark Souls 1 uses two distinct methods: leveling a character's base stats on a stat screen using souls, and weapon upgrading using both souls and titanite. Souls are gained through defeating enemies and bosses. They can also be gained using soul items found throughout the game. The leveling process has the player increasing one stat per level from the list of Vitality, increasing health; Attunement, increasing spell slots; Endurance, increasing stamina, maximum equip load, and bleed resistance; Strength, increasing damage with strength scaling weapons; Dexterity, increasing damage with dex scaling weapons and cast speed with attack spells; Resistance, increasing overall damage resistances with the exception of magic and lightning resistance; Intelligence, increasing damage with sorceries and int scaling weapons; and finally, Faith, increasing the damage of miracles, faith scaling weapons, and magic and lightning resistance. It is a simple yet effective system that allows a player to increase their power over time with integral opportunity cost built into the system. A player generally cannot max out every stat relevant to their build before New Game Plus, unless they farm souls specifically for leveling. Hence, every time a point is placed into a stat, that is a point not put into another. I mean, no shit, Sherlock. But the level economy being what it is allows this such that the system can flourish as one which is not superfluous or meaningless in any way because every level matters, to the point where veterans will often min-max their builds to stop leveling most stats at the soft cap. It is a system that emphasizes the idea that complexity does not equal depth. A mechanical system can have depth without complexity, and vice versa. Having said this, it is not without issues. The resistance stat is a junk stat that is an utter waste of levels. Resistance has the goal of allowing the player to prioritize defense during the level up process, but this stat is inert seeing as the player gains resistances when leveling any stat in the game, along with having the ability to level up health, which is a better defensive stat overall. A player's overall resistances are governed by their armor, overall player level, and their other stats, not just the resistance stat. Resistance being this way means that it has the possibility of being a level dump for new players. Once a player has a degree of experience and knowledge of the game systems, they will simply ignore resistance as a stat entirely, and that is an issue of balancing on behalf of the game. The player, at this point, traverses Firelink Shrine and decides their chosen path forward, Undead Burg being the quote-unquote correct choice. In reality, a player can choose to go in many directions. Undead Burg, Anor Londo Ruins, and the Catacombs are open to all players at this point. Players that started with the Master Key have access to the Valley of Drakes, Blighttown, the Great Hollow, Ash Lake, Darkroot Basin, Darkroot Garden, Lower Undead Burg, and Undead Parish, in addition to the previously stated areas. In all fairness, players without the Master Key can access these areas as well if they are able to drain the water out of Anor Londo Ruins, but doing that right from the off is so utterly rare and difficult that it's not worth adding to the discussion on the Master Key, of which we shall discuss in full later. What I shall discuss now, mind you, is a criticism of Dark Souls 1 that I would be remiss not to mention. The player can easily get the idea that the Catacombs are the correct path forward if they do not exhaust all of the Crestfallen Warriors' dialogue, leading to difficulty, death, and in worst case, getting stuck down there. While this is pointed out as a criticism of mechanics and level design, I point to the majority of the problems that players face regarding this issue being due to the marketing and reputation of the game. Dark Souls has been the poster child of difficulty in video games since its release. Many players talk up the ability to beat Dark Souls as a great challenge to overcome. This idea travelled far enough that the initial PC release of Dark Souls 1 adorned the mantle of Time to Die Edition. I don't usually like discussing the meta to critique a game, but this seems like a very unique aspect of Dark Souls that is worth mentioning. The idea of difficulty in a player's mind when traversing the graveyard near Firelink Shrine could have them wondering to the idea that, it's supposed to be this hard, this is Dark Souls. Players without foreknowledge of Dark Souls 1's reputation could easily infer that the graveyard is too difficult for them at such an early level and look for another direction to start their adventure in Lordran. I hesitate to call the graveyard's new player trap as a massive issue owing to these factors. I do sympathise with those who get stuck in that area though. I think making it an easier location to leave and backtrack through would alleviate a lot of these possible issues, and we'll get more into that when we fully discuss the Catacombs. Undead Burg is pretty good with a few optional zones to tackle, which are good additions to the area. It is constructed in a way that allows it to be traversed both forward and backward, while maintaining quality in both directions. This is due to the well-tuned enemy aggression radius when the player is behind them, and the various connecting structures that the zone is built with. Zones pre-Anor Londo must have this aspect in their design. The choice to limit warping between bonfires until Anor Londo is completed is important to facilitate the interconnected world of Dark Souls 1. To this end, areas in this early game section have to be functional levels, whether the player is pushing forwards or backtracking. Leaving the bonfire room will result in combat with the enemies that were fought on the way to it, but in a different environment, with an archer as the first enemy next to the stairway, and the bridge being pelted with firebombs facilitating an environmental hazard of sorts, whereas the way towards the bonfire has the player fighting melee hollows while having to avoid the aforementioned archer. There are obviously multiple ways to approach this encounter, like sprinting past the melee hollows to fight the archer first, but what this point is about, in essence, is that areas in the early game are designed to be functional and sometimes varied combat encounters when approached from different directions. Extrapolate how this tiny encounter is designed from this perspective to the rest of the encounters pre-Anor Londo, and it checks out. Speaking of bonfires, they are our checkpoints which the player respawns at once defeated. They are placed within levels and allow for a vast multitude of mechanics to be facilitated. Bonfires at a baseline allow for the player to sit at it to restore their health and Estus Flask charges. In exchange, all enemies are respawned, apart from a few exceptions including, but not limited to, bosses, Black Knights, and other mini-boss enemies such as the Armored Boar in Undead Parish and the Blow Dart Men in Blighttown. These few mechanics form the core of the Dark Souls gameplay loop. Areas must be conquered on the game's terms from bonfire to bonfire. One cannot subvert the game in this regard. How the player deals with these areas and enemies is entirely up to them, but the challenge remains consistent. This is fantastic for generating an experience that is shared among all players, while still being open enough to allow for a large degree of player agency. The aspect of the game's challenge is how Dark Souls gained its initial pull for many players, and it's why it's referred to so often in the topic of difficulty in gaming. Whether beating Dark Souls is bragworthy or not, it's easy to see why it gained its reputation, especially seeing as Dark Souls 1 was far less mainstream at the time of its release than Elden Ring is currently. Along with these main mechanics, bonfires also allow the player to become human, which has many mechanics associated with it in of itself, mostly relating to online play. The bonfire allows players to level up, slot spells, and kindle it, increasing the maximum number of Estus Flask charges when resting at that specific bonfire. Future item purchases, discovered covenants, and general progression unlock even more features, but we'll discuss those when we get to them. For now, let's discuss kindling and the Estus Flask, which is the player's main source of healing in Dark Souls 1. The Estus Flask heals the player and has a number of limited uses ranging from 5 to 20. These uses recharge upon a player's death and when they rest at a bonfire. The maximum number of uses it can restore to are determined based on how many times a player has kindled that bonfire, the default being 5. Along with this, the healing strength rises as players improve their flask at any Firekeeper using a Firekeeper soul. The actual act of healing has the player standing still while taking a swig of the flask. The time taken to do so is similar to that of using a light attack with a heavy weapon. All of these elements combine to create a fantastic risk versus reward system. One's health essentially determines how often and how much they can fuck up. The need to heal is, in essence, a punishment for making that mistake in the first place. What allows this system to be a great example of risk-reward is the player's choice of when to heal to do so unscathed, and the player's choice of how to manage their Estus charges. This is the reason why the healing takes around about a similar amount of time as attacks do, and it's a brilliant decision. Bosses usually leave themselves open enough to make at least one attack after their combo strings end, in which case the player can choose to land a heal instead of continuing their offensive. In Dark Souls, one may heal when they are not supposed to, leading to punishment. This risk means that how players choose to engage with the system is entirely up to their skill. Are you less confident? Get to safety and pop your heal in a less vulnerable location, using terrain and other emergent safe locations. Are you more confident? Pop your heal between enemy attacks while remaining in striking distance. The latter of these two distinct choices is a larger risk than the former, leaving the player character in a vulnerable state during their heal, but rewards the player further by keeping their flow in the fight and allows them to more easily set up their next actions. In contrast, the former choice reduces the risk, but the reward is also lower, breaking the flow of whatever fight is happening and setting up certain enemies for ranged or dash attacks against the player. This system is the gold standard of risk versus reward at a fundamental level. A lot of these choices need to be taken so swiftly that they end up as emergent and instinctual actions. Better players know when they can or cannot heal in a fight and use that to their advantage, not cracking under the pressure of a low health bar. Less experienced players will tend to panic or run at first sign of immediate danger, healing at the safest place that they can find in and amongst the chaos, or panic healing and taking damage due to that mistake. The only aspect that throws off some of the risk-reward aspects is the kindling system. which ought to be discussed alongside yet another overarching topic: difficulty. Dark Souls has static difficulty. The game's settings have no sliders, options, or modes that alter the game's various hurdles. Every playthrough has the same number of enemies with the same level of challenge. You can argue whether or not this is a good thing. I would personally vie for difficulty being a creative choice that any developer can make and is justified in doing so. But what cannot be argued is that this is what a lot of the experience of Dark Souls is predicated upon. I say all this to come in swinging with the reality that Dark Souls does have variable difficulty, despite what many may believe outside of the Souls community, but it is not decided by an arbitrary slider or mode when the player starts a run. The difficulty level in Dark Souls is entirely self-determined by certain mechanics that players may engage in. The player can make the game far less challenging, or far more challenging using mechanics that the game presents. For example, a player can choose to do challenge runs for a more difficult experience by intentionally neglecting specific mechanics. I have completed Dark Souls 1 at Soul Level 1 on multiple occasions, doing so again on stream in preparation for this video. This is an example of me throwing the level up mechanics to the wayside in order to give myself a specific, more challenging experience. In fact, I much prefer playing both Dark Souls 1 and 3 at Soul Level 1 at this point. Players who want to pursue a less arduous path can partake in the summoning mechanic, farm souls to be overleveled, use Havel's ring to allow for both medium rolls and high defensive stats, and they can kindle their bonfire, allowing for more healing. Not all of these are equivalent in how much easier they make the game, and some, I would argue, are detrimental to a player's first playthrough. Summoning for one can break the entire experience of a boss. However, they are all in the game to be used at the player's discretion. So without further ado, let's delve into kindling. Kindling requires becoming human, consuming one humanity and then using another humanity to increase the Estus maximum from 5 to 10. Once the player has defeated Pinwheel and is granted the right of kindling, they can use humanity up to twice more to get their Estus charges to a maximum of 20. Overall, I view this as somewhat excessive for a balanced experience. One of the factors that make the healing system of Dark Souls 1 so excellent is how the devs build an area's encounters from bonfire to bonfire under the assumption that the players will generally have 5, but may have 10 Estus. My evidence for this relates to the existence of Firelink Shrine at the start of the game. Firelink Shrine's bonfire starts with one level of kindling already applied, giving the player 10 Estus. From Firelink Shrine to the Undead Burg bonfire, new players will be hard-pressed to use all 10 Estus charges. Veteran players can easily go through the first zone without taking hits, but even if we grant a couple of mistakes, the player will still have over 5 Estus charges as they reach the bonfire. New players tend to die in this zone for a whole slew of reasons before a lack of healing sets in. Falling into a pit, panicking during combat, incorrect spacing, failing to lock on, and forgetting to use a shield are all reasons for new player deaths before running out of Estus. As the player's skills, Estus flask, and character strength improve during the game's progression, so do the strength and quantity of enemies between zones, such that 5 to 10 charges remain balanced. This is why allowing 15 to 20 Estus charges can be viewed simply as excessive, allowing the player to be able to make up to double the mistakes that they can with a more balanced pool of 5 to 10. So how much of an issue is this? Not all that much. Kindling is a part of the player's toolkit that can be used at one's discretion. At the end of the day, the player still has to beat the challenge themselves with their other equipment. If a player has hundreds of heals but cannot land a single hit, they will still fail. There's a more pressing discussion to be had on the topic of the right of kindling's acquisition requirements. Killing Pinwheel straight after the tutorial is a feat that can still be a decent challenge for a large number of veteran players, let alone new players, especially with how infuriating the trek back to Firelink Shrine is from the catacombs before warp is unlocked. This is owing to the dangerous terrain, traps, regenerating skeletons, and hard to map pathways. By the time kindling can allow players to decrease the challenge substantially, most players have already tested their mettle against Ornstein and Smough, a boss which is essentially the final test of whether a player can and will beat the game. To conclude the discussion on this system, it has some bizarre design choices and would be improved if the right of kindling was either removed or its acquisition requirement was adjusted to allow players that feel they need it to more easily access it earlier than post Ornstein and Smough. Undead Burg continues as normal, remaining focused on hollows as the enemies owing to their humanoid appearance, making it easier for players to read animations, which is a boon for newcomers to the game. The flaming barrel on the staircase reinforces the lesson that the boulder taught in the Asylum. And with that, we get to the first non-tutorial boss of Dark Souls 1, the Taurus Demon. I say first in air quotes because players do not have to fight Taurus Demon first. Without the Master Key or draining Anor Londo, players can fight him or Pinwheel first. With the Master Key, players have the choice between the Taurus Demon, Pinwheel, Capra Demon, Quelaag, Moonlight Butterfly, Great Grey Wolf Sif, the Bell Gargoyles, and the Stray Demon. Taurus Demon is the boss balanced to be the next boss after the Asylum Demon, and many of these options listed are generally far too strong for a new player at such a low character and equipment level. But the choice is there to fight those bosses regardless, which improves subsequent playthroughs. The Taurus Demon is in a thin arena housed atop a wall's ramparts. The creature only appears after the player has walked about halfway down the walkway and has two hollows pelting the player with arrows on a tower near the fog door. The common strategy for this fight is to climb the ladder to deal with the archers before spawning the demon. Once the boss arrives, turn around and reclimb the ladder to plunge attack the boss. One can fight it normally, but this method is used by a large number of players because it is a lesson taught by the tutorial. The plunging attack was taught as something to take advantage of. This is the only time that it is used again in a boss fight like this, and it's sort of like the exam following the lecture. Players will get stuck in Undead Burg for longer than normal if they do not take the lessons they should have learned from the Undead Asylum to heart, and thus it makes sense that the Taurus Demon is essentially a harder version of the Asylum Demon. This is owing to his slightly faster attacks, smaller arena, and ability to jump onto the platform if the player is up there for too long. Both are not spectacular bosses in terms of their movesets in comparison to the best of the bosses that we get from the series, but they are serviceable for the goal they are trying to achieve as being introductory bosses to the world of Dark Souls, both visually and mechanically. That's a topic. Mechanics. We should probably discuss the overall moment-to-moment combat of Dark Souls before we progress any further. The combat that has defined the series hinges on the stamina mechanic and commitment to actions. Whenever the player takes an action in Dark Souls, they are locked into that action until the animation has concluded. This is taken into effect whether the player is rolling, using an item, attacking, healing, or any other action that requires time to complete. This aspect does require the game to input buffer, but we'll discuss that more when we get to the later games. Stamina is a fantastically designed system that, in combination with the previous mechanic, allows for combat which is very deliberate and predicated upon choice. Attacking, rolling, and sprinting consumes stamina, and once stamina is fully drained, a player cannot commit to any of those three actions. Couple that with the inability to animation cancel, and a system is created where combat has an inherent risk versus reward system built in. Every action that the player takes during combat can be seen as a risk, owing to these two mechanics being limiting factors on how much a player can do in a short amount of time. Now, an overly risky combat system sounds all well and good, but what is the reward to compensate? In fights with most regular enemies, attacks from the player will stagger them, sometimes even during the enemy's attack animations for the most part. Each enemy has its own poise damage threshold to land the stagger. The stagger is very consistent, and needs to be because players rely on the consistency of stagger mechanics a lot during combat in almost all games where it exists as a feature. Devs need to understand how important stagger consistency is for gameplay, a fact that From Software fortunately understands. It is not perfect in Dark Souls 1, but it works far, far more often than it doesn't. The stagger is one of the key mechanics why the high-risk, high-reward aspect of Souls combat works so well against the regular enemies in the game, allowing the player to fight safer, rolling and blocking until they get their moment to strike. It also allows players to play more aggressive, attacking enemies during their wind-ups to get quicker kills at the risk of taking damage. But what of bosses and regular enemies with higher poise? The bosses and high poise enemies that are well made, of which most of them are made with the player's limitations of stamina and animations in mind. Regular enemies do not have to be beholden to this standard because of how easily they go down, and how many of them a player could end up fighting at once. A great many higher poise enemies and all bosses, except Gravelord Nito and Capra Demon, are fought without accompanying basic enemies, and are made to have combos short enough so that a player does not burn through all of their stamina rolling while still hitting hard and often enough to be a challenge. This combat system facilitates a large quantity of weapons, builds, playstyles, and strategies. What it is not is complex. Bear in mind that complexity does not equal quality, but it is not the combat that makes Dark Souls 1 special. It's all the supplemental mechanics, enemies, areas, and methods of delivering engaging gameplay and atmosphere outside of and surrounding combat that gives Dark Souls its identity and experience, even though the game is an action game at its core. I'll be referencing certain moments and bosses in Dark Souls as ones which are experiential, or I shall describe how something enhances or hurts the overall experience throughout this entire video. It's probably worth me defining my terms, as experience or experiential could be used as a pretentious way of sugarcoating badly designed elements of the game, which is not my intention in the slightest. When I say that something in Dark Souls is designed to be experiential, what I'm referring to is where the developer's aim was to provide the player with experiences unlike the ones that can be achieved through standard means. These methods include subversion of expectations, which could be good or bad depending on context, visual design, thematic throughline, unique mechanics, or novel ideas. When something is using one of these elements, that does not immediately equate to them being good or shielded from criticism. When something is going for experiential aspects, especially mechanical ones, flaws will still be called out and explored. Some action games, like Devil May Cry, are trying to give you a constant mechanical experience of intensive combat. Dark Souls is not. Sometimes they do make experiences which are that of the conventional action game mold, like Ornstein and Smough and Bell Gargoyles. Others are trying to give you experiences that are not conventional, like Iron Golem, Moonlight Butterfly, and Quelaag. And sometimes, FromSoft manages to marry these two and give us a boss like Artorias or Gwyn. How well these unconventional experiences are delivered will also be criticized, but it is not fair to put a boss like Moonlight Butterfly into the same category as Artorias. They are clearly both going for different methods of engaging the player and will be judged as such. Therefore, Bell Gargoyles will not be criticized for a lack of experiential aspects, and Iron Golem will not be criticized for a lack of modular Artorias-style movesets. Doing so would be misguided and would rip away the foundation of how the bosses and/or areas of the game are designed. Pressing on, we meet the main man himself, Solaire. We'll discuss NPCs as a whole later, so instead let's move on to a more controversial topic. If the player progresses Solaire's questline by saying yes to him in this instance, he gives us the White Soapstone. So it's time to discuss summoning. During traversal and boss fights, players can summon a maximum of one NPC or, if playing online, another human player to aid them in their journey until the player, summon, or boss dies. To summon, the player must use one humanity to become human at the bonfire and find a summon sign on the floor, many of which will appear near a bonfire or a fog door. A slight trade-off of becoming human is also being susceptible to invasions from other players, and, in some unique cases, NPCs. The issue with summoning is that it completely breaks enemy AI. Enemy AI in Dark Souls 1 is designed to fight a single enemy combatant. AI in this game can simply not account for multiple adversaries. Their movesets and combos are designed to focus on a singular player. One can simply run from the enemy to have them focus on the summon, and can achieve many free hits as the AI wails on the summoned unit. There are even times when AI cannot decide which unit to attack and bounces from aggro to aggro until they finally attack either the player or the summon. When the player gets targeted, they can simply run from the enemy and repeat the previous steps. This entirely changes fights to their excruciating detriment when a unit is summoned, allowing for a vast number of increased mistakes, free moments to heal, free moments to attack, and sometimes, depending on the summon, can allow players to win without fighting the boss at all, by allowing the summon to solo the challenge. The saving grace of the summoning system is that it is an exterior mechanic not tied to the player's toolkit, but rather a method of engaging in multiplayer. NPC summons exist in this regard to simulate online experiences when playing offline, as seen by the existence of NPC invasions being the same thing. FromSoft knows that at some point, the player count will dwindle and the servers will be taken down, not to mention those who simply do not have access to the internet, which was more common in 2011. Thus, NPC summons and invasions allow the game to keep a part of the online experience without necessitating being connected to the internet. This is another element of player-dictated difficulty. If a player needs help or wants to blow past bosses without experiencing them at their best, they can use the extraneous mechanic of summoning and is signposted as such with what Solaire says to the player. It is not what the game was built for and is clearly its own thing. It's like playing the game on a separate mode. Just to be clear, the fact that summoning changes the experience of Dark Souls 1 does not equate to your experience being invalid if you chose to engage with it. Summoning definitely changes the game for the worse, and I would advise players not to engage with it on their first run to get the best experience possible. Having said this, just because the experience is worse or easier mechanically, doesn't mean that you didn't really beat Dark Souls or anything silly like that. Your experiences are your own, and this is a mechanic that is in the game, for better or for worse, to be used at anyone's discretion. This is a disclaimer in case anyone calls me an elitist for critiquing this mechanic, an unfortunate thing that does happen whenever anybody calls out this system's mechanical issues online. It's a consequence of actual elitists in this community who think they're better than everyone else for not summoning. Your own experiences using this mechanic, however positive or negative, being valid is absolutely unarguable. Summoning making bosses mechanically worse is unarguable just the same. These are not mutually exclusive. All I advise is that those watching who have never beaten the game without summoning simply try doing so. It will be very worth your while. Moving forward past Solaire, we are introduced to the Drake. It breathes fire all over the bridge and does not signpost its arrival the first time that it arrives. It would be improved if the Drake was either already at the end of the bridge, or if the Drake didn't spew fire from overhead as it flew towards its perch. The instance of it spewing fire on arrival is a cheap way to challenge the player with no signposting that it's on its way until they are hit by the flames. This is especially poor seeing as there are occasions where this attack will kill the player, either because they are not at full health and do not expect random unavoidable damage, or because sometimes this attack can be a full 100-0 one-shot. This has happened to me multiple times. The damage of this attack is very inconsistent, and that is a huge problem. As a side note, obviously every time I bring up an issue or a point of praise, please don't assume that every argument is equally as impactful as another. This Drake's attack is quite the nitpick. The previous point of summoning breaking enemy AI is a far larger issue. There is a scale, and I'm not going to signpost the level of these critiques or praises because the degree to which these critiques or praises impact the final product is difficult to perfectly nail until we reach the conclusion. The following area is the Undead Parish. Already we see the challenge rising from the Undead Burg with the introduction of status ailments and multiple kill-once mini-boss style enemies, whereas Undead Burg had only the one Black Knight off the beaten path. While basic enemies respawn both on death and resting at a bonfire, there are a few enemies not classed as bosses that do not respawn. This is for multiple reasons. The first is that it allows for the facilitation of more challenging enemies in the early areas without making the area far more difficult overall on every run back and run through. The player is rewarded with an easier area to progress and backtrack through by killing the enemy once. These enemies allow for playthroughs to be unique with rare item drops that cannot be farmed, owing to them not respawning. The player gets one roll at their drop table. An example of this is the uncommon Black Knight's halberd that can be acquired from the Black Knight in Darkroot Garden next to the Grass Crest Shield. It is a simple yet effective method of increasing the challenge of an area without tilting the balance of the game too far in one direction. Hence why these enemies generally appear more in the early game areas with effective asset reuse by using later game enemies for some of these mini-bosses. I think that it's a smart choice to have the rats appear right at the start of the zone. At this early stage, depending on the player's selection of armor, one can become easily affected with poison. In the event of this, players will either need to retreat to retry the area, or use the vast majority of their Estus to heal through the damage over time. That is, if they don't die. Having the rats halfway through the area at this early of a player level would only serve to frustrate, seeing as it is not communicated that rats proc poison until the player is hit by one, and can see the status ailment bar pop up. You can think of this rat room as a soft tutorial for status ailments. Undead Parish contains an extensive multitude of topics to discuss once we get to this area. The elevator inside the church marks the start of one of Dark Souls 1's greatest strengths, the interconnected world. Finding Firelink Shrine when descending the elevator is a mechanical payoff that reveals to the players the splendorous nature of how the world comes together. A real-time realization that the world isn't a series of linear connected levels, but an actual place to be traversed as if it really existed, with all manner of shortcuts and elevators to take full advantage of. There is a reason why so many players talk about the simple act of using an elevator from Undead Parish to Firelink Shrine so fondly. Using an elevator is made into a fantastic moment for many players as they come to realize that this transport has taken them home after spending time in the more dangerous Undead Parish and Burg without the need for a loading screen or anything else of that sort. This is a factor that will continue to prosper in the first half of Dark Souls 1. The world is interconnected through its fantastic level design and in multiple instances opens up progressively, leading to a world described as Metroidvania inspired, yet done so well that it not only set a new precedent for Souls games, but video games as a whole. Dark Souls 1's level design is utterly brilliant because of how everything comes together, and how areas are remade as scenery when they should be realistically visible in the distance. The best example of this are the demon ruins recreated when viewed in the Tomb of the Giants, and Sen's Fortress recreated in the distance when viewed from the Taurus Demon's arena. I say recreated specifically, because at the time DS1 was made, hardware limitations did not allow these areas to actually be loaded into the scenery. FromSoft went the extra mile to create these areas as part of the scenery of locations where the recreated areas should be visible. This consistency assists to the greater sense of immersion and the feeling that Lordran is a real place. The game is very grounded, both visually and mechanically. All of this is done masterfully. However, upon completion of Anor Londo, the interconnectedness takes a dip. Areas lead to dead ends, and backtracking crosses from an interesting and challenging aspect of traversal that increases the appreciation for the cohesion of the world, into an unacceptably long and arduous journey from one end of the world to another. Thus, warp is introduced once Ornstein and Smough have been overcome. It is a good solution to the problem of an interconnected world becoming too large, along with allowing for interesting areas that cannot be facilitated otherwise, like Nito's arena, the Abyss, and the entrance to the DLC. There is a broader discussion to be had on the existence of the warp mechanic that we will have later on, and it will continue to come up throughout the videos on the later games. The next thing to discuss in this church area is the Firekeeper's Soul. As stated before, Firekeeper's Souls upgrade the player's Estus flask by increasing the healing quantity per flask when taken to a Firekeeper. The system is pretty standard and doesn't have much in the way of complexities except for one addition that increases its interest a little bit. A player can acquire a Firekeeper's Soul by killing a Firekeeper and locking off their specific bonfire from being used. It's nothing revolutionary, but it's a neat little mechanical feature that a player can choose to sacrifice certain bonfires in exchange for a stronger Estus flask. Also, some kind of guidance or tutorial would help make new players not eat their first fucking soul. I did this on my first run, and many players have had the exact same experience, and it's an annoying aspect of where the lack of handholding sometimes hurts the game due to the description's ambiguity. However, I must still bide my time until handholding can be discussed in full. Next we arrive at Andre's area, which contains the first warpable bonfire after Firelink Shrine. Andre is the player's primary blacksmith, as he's the only fast warpable blacksmith and is the most common one that players give embers to. Out of the 10 embers in the game, 5 of them are for Andre and the rest of them are spread between Rickert, the giant blacksmith, and Vamos. I won't be revisiting Blacksmith's mechanics after this point. With a video as dense and as long as this, it's important not to cross the line from thorough to tedious, so let's discuss them in tandem instead of individually. The Blacksmiths allow the player to purchase items with souls and upgrade weapons with a combination of souls and upgrade materials in the forms of Titanite of various sizes and colours. Titanite can be acquired by killing certain enemies, from pickups in the world, trading with Snuggly, feeding Frampt, and purchasing them from blacksmiths. Weapon upgrades are the most important factor towards increasing one's damage in Dark Souls. Pumping levels into a damage stat is negligible in the early game in comparison to leveling health and or endurance, and my evidence for this would be the Soul Level 1 run. That challenge does not utilize a build that lacks damage, far from it. Its main difficulty lies in the lack of health, endurance, and weapon options. It remains viable on the damage front because of the ability to upgrade weapons to keep them applicable no matter the amount of damage stats that the build may have. Soul Level 1 characters definitely deal less damage than a build which levels a damage stat in conjunction with health and endurance, but nevertheless it remains damaging enough to where a lack of damage will not be a player's main concern during the run. The weapon upgrading mechanic overall works for its intended goal as a system that aims to promote player progression of strength in more ways than just the levels. It also is a method of attaching players to their chosen weapon. The player will not likely gain enough resources to fully upgrade more than 1 to 2 weapons that scale correctly with their build, unless they are extremely thorough, in which case they can acquire 3 regular slabs with a 10% chance to acquire another on each of the crystal lizards in the Great Hollow. A player can gain more than that through farming Dark Wraiths, but generally, a player usually attains up to 2 slabs of their build's associated Titanite type. Titanite colours generally correlate with different skill scalings for weapons. The standard strength and dexterity focused weapon types use standard Titanite, whereas divine weapons, which scale with faith, are upgraded with green and white Titanite, etc. As a quick side note, it is quite an interesting design decision that none of the regular Titanite slabs are placed along the critical path. Strength and dex slabs are a resource that must be found through exploration and willingness to do side content such as the DLC, Northern Undead Asylum, the Great Hollow, and Sigmaya's questline, which ends in Ash Lake. All of these factors melded together is why the system works as well as it does. It is a competently made weapon upgrading system that uses the non-linear progression of Dark Souls 1 to its advantage. Exploration is complemented by the rewards gained through traversal. This is taken to the nth degree, seeing as fully upgrading weapons requires slabs, encouraging a deeper engagement with the world in order to reach apex power. The only negative critique that I have for Titanite and weapon upgrading as a whole is the inequality of the quantity of Titanite types. The standard Titanite is the most common and the rest are far more obscure. Titanite shards, large Titanite shards, and Titanite chunks are very commonly found along the critical path, leading to a sustained level of growth for the most common builds, being strength and dex based. The issue lies in an inherent soft punishment for builds which focus on faith or intelligence, leading to their upgrades being more off the beaten path and harder to obtain than what is required for strength and dex builds. This is a clear and stark issue of imbalance, the basis of which is a symptom of another system that many players forget the existence of. The reason why the player is showered with more regular Titanite on the critical path than that of other types is because of armor upgrading. Dark Souls 1 allows the player to upgrade their armor using regular Titanite the same way that they can upgrade weapons. It is a completely and utterly pointless system as the base unupgraded armor is entirely sufficient for the vast majority of players. Because of the inclusion of armor upgrading, FromSoft had to make sure that the player can upgrade both their armor and their weapon if they are to use normal weapons. This leads to builds using regular Titanite for weapon upgrading having a clear advantage in accessing their upgrade materials over that of other weapon types, as they will tend to primarily use the found Titanite for their weapon and only delve into the armor upgrading system once their weapon has been maxed out. Two solutions to this issue are either to have the armor upgrades use a separate resource, a practice that may lead to item bloat, or scrap armor upgrading entirely. Moving on, the player now has access to 3 locations that they may traverse. One is the locked gate of Sen's fortress, currently occupied by Sigmaya. Another is further exploration of the Undead Parish and its church, leading to the battle with the Bell Gargoyles. The final location that one may explore is entirely optional, and it is what we shall discuss now: Darkroot Garden. Dark Souls does not hold the player's hand with where one is supposed to go. You have to explore and figure this world out for yourself. To this end, many players, either before or after Bell Gargoyles, can end up mistaking Darkroot Garden for the next location on the critical path. Along the way, they'll kill some grass people, and usually end up with at least 1 or 2 purple moss clumps. The area is quite large, with a lot of moving parts, connecting to Undead Parish, the Valley of Drakes, and Undead Burg, the latter 2 connections being within Darkroot Basin, an extension of Darkroot Garden. The main criticism I have concerning this area relates to Illusory Walls, which isn't only relegated to Darkroot Garden, but Dark Souls 1 as a whole. Darkroot Garden simply contains one of the most pervasive uses of it in the game as far as I am concerned. In Dark Souls, there are 15 walls that are simply in existence to hide areas and loot. When hit or rolled through, they disappear for good, with the exception of the illusory wall in Sen's Fortress that cannot be rolled through for whatever fucking reason. My issue with the illusory walls is extremely simple. They are not telegraphed whatsoever, and it is terrible. How, pray tell, is one supposed to discern that there are walls which hide areas when they look identical to all other walls? There is no shimmer upon closer inspection, no distinct sound cue, or any other factor that would assist with players' learning of their existence. In addition, suppose that a player happens to find one by accident. What then? Are they just supposed to hit every single wall they walk past in the hope that one of the thousands of structures in the game is illusory? If illusory walls are identical to all other walls, then you know that means that any wall could be illusory till proven otherwise. It's insane to me that this is in the game in the way that it is, when even mimics have telegraphs. When we discuss warping in about, I don't know, an hour, then we'll discuss my issues with illusory walls again in further depth. The reason why I'm discussing them now is because of the unacceptable element of Darkroot Garden's illusory wall hiding the area's bonfire. What the fuck? Further through the garden, we find the Moonlight Butterfly. Moonlight Butterfly is the first of many experiential bosses in Dark Souls. It is one of a few bosses that can be seen before the player enters the fog door. Mechanically speaking, it's not fantastic, it's rather poor. But it is unique, for better or for worse. It flies around spewing projectiles at the player, every now and again landing on the ledge of the bridge to rest. Characters with a ranged option of some sort will have a much easier time against it, as they do not have to wait for it to land. This does not apply to sorcerers as much as other ranged damage dealers, unfortunately, as Moonlight Butterfly has relatively high magic resistance. It is a fight that is not designed to be a mechanical test of skill, but rather an experience to be had. Its design is distinct from everything fought up till that point, and its music is a departure from the usual tense style from the previous boss fights. Whether or not this was a powerful experience for you personally doesn't matter. Everyone is different in how they'll respond or react to media. What cannot be argued is that this is what the Moonlight Butterfly is designed to be in aid of. I cannot delve into every experience that a player could have because of how specific and subjective that topic is. So instead, let us use Moonlight Butterfly as a case study to delve into a more interesting mechanical topic that I've already somewhat alluded to: enemy resistances and weaknesses. Bosses and enemies in Dark Souls can have vulnerability, resistance, and immunity to the various damage types and status ailments in the game. On a surface level devoid of nuance, this system has issues with making different builds reach certain roadblocks unique to each build, owing to enemies that simply counter that build stat-wise. The nuance that throws a wrench into this critique is that removing this system to allow for a smoother gameplay experience would, in turn, harm the grounded nature of the game. One cannot kill a fire monster with fire damage in Dark Souls 1. Removing resistances and immunities would allow the player to do this and all kinds of other things similar, and thus remove a layer of believability. Dark Souls 1's grounded aesthetic is one of its greatest strengths, and sacrificing it to improve the game's balance is a tough choice to make, so I don't think that one can criticize this without showing their biases. While one player may prefer to have the game retain a sense of grounded believability, another may prefer the game to make strides towards balancing the combat without taking much into consideration on the topic of internal consistency. Except I'm going to go against the grain and say that this is wrong. There is a correct answer to this. To quote Matthew Matosis directly,
"We have to confront a hard truth that few people seem to want to face about the Souls games, including FromSoft themselves, but here it is. The combat is nothing remarkable. Before you get your codpiece in a twist, keep in mind that doesn't equate to mediocre gameplay. As a whole, it's hugely elevated by generally great level design, player freedom, loadout options, and some unique supplemental mechanics like World Tendency, Covenants, and Insight. The stamina system puts other action RPGs to shame, the animations are great, and the controls are tight, but in terms of actual complexity, there's not much going on.
I couldn't have put it better myself. It's the factors and mechanics around and parallel to combat that gives Dark Souls its mechanical depth. This includes, but is not limited to, the stamina system, enemy attack patterns and behavior, environmental hazards, level design, damage types both from the player and from enemies, the poise system, the equip load system, and the world design. Most of these mechanics are not directly correlated with the moment-to-moment player inputs during combat, but they all affect that experience to different degrees. Removing damage immunities and high defenses that certain enemies have to increase the balance of combat to the detriment of immersion is a fine argument to make on the surface, and I don't blame anyone for holding this opinion, but it misses the mark of what Dark Souls is and what makes it so special in the first place. The player character is not powerful relative to the other creatures and beings of this world, populated by all manner of gods, demons, and dragons. The whole point of the game's experience and flow is about using one's own intuition, wit, well-timed rolls, and an undying perseverance to overcome even the greatest of foes. It isn't intuitive that a fire monster can be set on fire, and including the ability to do so would harm the overall experience of Dark Souls 1 substantially, in being contradictory to the entire design philosophy of the game. The changes that I would want to see with enemy resistances in Dark Souls 1 would be the types of changes that improve the balance of the game while keeping the grounded aesthetic intact. For example, I would alter the magic resistance of some of the bosses that have a high resistance to magic damage for seemingly no reason. The Sanctuary Guardian being my best example. He spews lightning, so a resistance to that damage type makes sense. Its magic resistance is not intuitive and only hinders the experience. I do want to be sure that you know that I do not agree with every point Matt makes in his The Lost Soul Arts of Demon Souls video. Hell, I may not even agree with most of them once these analysis videos are done. It is specifically this quote that I think is a poignant observation as to what Dark Souls is at the core. Once the Moonlight Butterfly has been taken care of though, the player receives the key to the tower connecting Darkroot Basin to Undead Burg, resided by Havel. Havel drops his ring when he dies, which allows us to discuss a few more overarching topics. Armor, armor equip load, poise, rolling iframes, and rings. Armor works like one would assume. There are slots for a helmet, chest piece, leggings, and gloves, with armor sets scattered around the game that fit into these slots. Any character can wear any armor, so there becomes an interesting question. How is it balanced? Equip load and poise, although not perfect, are two fantastic solutions to this. Poise is a stat gained in Dark Souls determined by the armor worn. The general trend is the heavier the armor, the higher the poise. Poise is essentially the player character's stagger resistance. Each attack from both the player and any enemy does a degree of poise damage. This damage does not reflect onto the health bar of the struck target, but determines how staggered the target will be depending on the target's poise. High poise damage attacks against a low poise target can have them falling onto the ground, whereas if the target's poise is high enough, then a low poise attack will not stagger the target at all. This system is in effect for both enemies and the player, along with all attacks from both as well. An entity with high poise, whether player or enemy, can tank attacks without their actions being interrupted. This system is great for the most part, but before we can draw any conclusions, we need to talk about equip load. A player character's equip load maximum is determined by their endurance stat and a few other variables, such as rings. Their current equip load is determined by their equipped armor, rings, weapons, and shields. Equip load does not limit how much a player can carry by locking off items once the maximum has been reached, like in a lot of games with an encumbrance system. Instead, equipment load determines one's sprinting speed, iframes, and rolling speed. Rolling is a key defensive action in Dark Souls 1. It has the player rolling in a defined direction of their choice, and during part of the roll, the player character gains invulnerability frames, or iframes for short, in which they cannot take damage and can clip through many attacks. The player is not able to roll through all collision boxes though. Typically, the consensus is that the enemy's weapons are clippable, but their body is not. The roll is part of the core combat loop. Blocking against most bosses is a valid strategy, but can be ill-advised depending on the attack in question, and the shield in use, so well-timed rolls become the main test of skill during the dance of boss fights. How weight interacts with rolls is done masterfully as a system, especially with the poise system also in play. The rolls are categorized into 4 categories. Fast roll, when current equip load is 0 to 25% of the player's maximum. Medium roll, 26 to 50%. Fat roll, 50% to 100%. And over encumbered, above 100%. The number of iframes on each roll type is 13, 11, 9, and 0 respectively. The over encumbered roll has 0 iframes because it isn't even a roll. Pressing the roll button while above 100% equip load staggers the player. These systems work so well as a method of balancing armor because they allow heavy armor not to be strictly better than light armor during combat. Many games attempt to balance light and heavy armor, but fail because they do not have enough cons that make up for the pros of gaining higher defense through the use of heavy armor. Skyrim is a perfect example of how not to balance light and heavy armor. Heavy armor being strictly better than light outside of a few niche cases, because the stat line is always higher with heavy armor in that game, and the only limiting factors added are movement speed penalties, which don't change combat in any way meaningfully, and stealth penalties, which can be completely negated with the right spells, perks, and enchantments. The increase in weight and poise for stronger armor in Dark Souls directly affects combat in a way that counteracts the problems that would become emergent without them. The reason why poise is so important as a system to include is because of how important rolling is. When a player has a fat roll, and even a medium roll to some extent, the movement can feel a lot more hamstrung during fights owing to the longer roll and reduced invulnerability window. Therefore, allowing heavier armor users to ignore further control penalties by avoiding staggers that can catch out the light rollers allows heavy armor usage to exist as a valid strategy. That is the whole point of balance after all. The only issues that I have concerning these systems relate to one specific armor set and the existence of a particular ring. Funnily enough, both of these belong to one man, Havel the Rock. The aptly named Havel's ring increases the player's maximum equip load by 50%. This ring is extremely powerful, thus it's difficult to think of builds that don't benefit from its use. This ring has the potential to create imbalance within the armor system that I described and complemented prior, and I'm sure you can imagine why. I needn't explain that based on the entire previous section. However, there is an example of how it can be not just imbalance, but genuinely somewhat game-breaking on the higher end with Havel's armor set. It has the second highest total armor rating and the highest poise in the game. When this set is in use with a decent endurance stat and Havel's ring, this extremely heavy and powerful set can be used while the player is at a medium roll. Which is insane, seeing as this armor set needs enemy attacks to be very specifically strong in order to stagger the player. With a Zweihander, Grass Crest Shield, Havel's set, and Havel's ring, a player requires 44 endurance to medium roll, which is not that much of an insane stat to reach at all. But that's being generous that the player is also not using the Ring of Favor and Protection. If they are, then the endurance requirement for a medium roll with the exact same build is a mere 30 points. Bear in mind that this was calculated using a heavy weapon and a shield. I think that the solution is to not remove the ring, but instead to nerf it or give it some kind of limitation. It's mostly fine, giving a few more defensive stats while allowing players to remain at a light or medium roll. It's during the worst case scenario that this ring suffers, which is unique as far as rings go, as they tend to be overall quite modest in their effects. The player has 2 ring slots to use any rings of their choice. They have a weight cost attached to them, although small, and provide passive benefits to the player. It is a decent system that doesn't shoot to be interesting in any unique way, like providing benefits that would allow for whole builds to be built around them, but they achieve the goal of being slight build enhancers. The most interesting ring of all, based on the mechanical complexity it offers, is one I've mentioned in passing, the Ring of Favour and Protection, or the FAP ring for short. The FAP ring provides the player with an increase in maximum equip load, max stamina, and max health. It's a pretty large benefit to be gained from a single ring. The trade-off is that taking off the ring breaks it for good. It's nothing too crazy, but it's the most mechanically interesting ring that the game has to offer, excluding the Calamity ring. We'll get back to Darkroot later. For now, it's time to discuss the remaining section of Undead Parish and the Bell Gargoyles. Up the stairs of the church, we fight against the first channeler in the game. These magic creatures show up in many instances throughout the game, mainly found within the Duke's archives. They are one of the many mini-boss enemies that show up more than once to increase the challenge of each area they're in until they're dealt with. They are some of the more important enemies to defeat in any given encounter, as they can buff the attack of the other enemies within their radius. That is what makes the top room of the Undead Parish's church so dangerous for the inexperienced. The top floor of the church is littered with 10 hollows, and it is here which gives us the best case study into why the combat system does not gel well with a large number of enemies. Don't get me wrong, the game can and does facilitate multi-enemy encounters, and in some instances, even bosses. But just because it is functional does not mean that it is the game playing to its strengths. For basic enemies, the best way to deal with groups is to find a choke point and hack away at the crowd as they're making their way through the narrow terrain. It's not exactly inspired gameplay. The game is not a hack and slash. For bosses, well, we'll get to them. With boss encounters, it really is a case-by-case basis based on that boss's specific context. Fortunately, we have a great example right in front of us, Bell Gargoyles. It is a boss fight that opens up with the player fighting one gargoyle atop the roof of the church. The gargoyle has a variety of tail, flying, halberd, and fire breath attacks. Once this first gargoyle is at or below 50% HP, a second gargoyle emerges, thus becoming a multi-enemy boss fight. This fight is generally seen as the first major test of skill for new players. Testing positioning because of the second gargoyle, which focuses on AoE fire breath attacks, the arena being one that a player can fall off of, situational awareness to know what the other gargoyle is doing while the player is busy dealing with their main target, and patience, as greedy attacks and movement will often make the player vulnerable to the various attacks that either gargoyle can use. I just brushed past a point, but I want to emphasize this element further. The fact that the second gargoyle is more likely to use fire attacks, whereas the other will prioritize melee attacks, is the glue that holds this fight together as one of quality. Multi-target boss fights suffer unless care is taken into the behavior of the enemies to complement each other. This is because two identical gargoyles can and will overwhelm even the best of players, as defensive actions in Dark Souls, like rolling, blocking, and parrying, generally struggle to guard the player against many hits. If both gargoyles were to use the same attack at a slight offset in timing, then a player could easily burn through their stamina blocking, or get caught during the recovery frames of rolling, even if they successfully avoid the first attack. Unavoidable damage is a cheap method of delivering a challenging experience, and only works in very scarce and unique moments, such that devs should avoid using it at all costs. The second gargoyle appearing partway through is also another element that aids the fight's quality, allowing players to deal massive damage to the first gargoyle before the other shows up, usually making the boss fight a one-on-one fight for much more time than it is ever a multi-boss fight. This is the factor that allows more experienced players to view this boss as a DPS check. The first gargoyle can be killed during the time it takes for the second gargoyle to reach the arena from the bell tower. Overall, this is a very well-designed fight with careful consideration for the group mechanics, well-telegraphed attacks, good hitboxes, and to be fair, that's the entire game for the most part, and an interesting arena that a player must be conscious of. And no, I haven't forgotten about the tail weapon. We'll get to them later. Once the bell gargoyles have been dispatched, the first bell of awakening can be rang on the top of the church tower. If a player has not been talking to NPCs, exploring thoroughly, and paying attention to where they can and cannot go, this is the point where a player can get stuck. The crestfallen warrior clearly states the true destination of the two bells.
There are, actually, 2 bells of awakening. One's up above in the Undead Church. The other is far, far below, in the ruins at the base of Blighttown. Ring them both, and something happened. Brilliant, right? Not much to go on. But I have a feeling that won't stop you. So, off you go.
The description of the basement key reads, opens the narrow passage leading below at the far face of the great bridge in the Undead Burg. The lower Undead Burg is a treacherous place. And then it continues to describe the danger of lower Undead Burg. The key is placed such that it is difficult to miss, but then again, reading item descriptions is not a common occurrence among many players. Reading this key clearly communicates that it opens the locked door that a player would have seen on the bridge with the Drake. But without reading it, as stated previously, the Darkroot Garden can appear to be the next location to traverse along the critical path. Needless to say, the game does not hold your hand. Now, how far does handholding extend, and are there qualitative statements that we can make either way? What I described previously regarding the key is an example of the grounded aesthetic of Dark Souls leveraging a level of trust in the player's engagement with the world to figure out what they are supposed to do. The world isn't going to bend over backwards to make sure that the player doesn't get stuck. On a more personal note, while getting stuck has an element of frustration, it's one I've grown to appreciate with every new game, as it's an element that I can only feel once in each instance. Whenever anyone says that they wish they could wipe their memory to experience a game for the first time again, it is feelings adjacent to that which I've described that they are seeking. This is what the lack of handholding facilitates in a game like Dark Souls, an experience unique to every player so they may get immersed in the world. Of course, many players will just use Google, and I don't think that's the fault of the game or the player. Not every player will be engaged to the same degree and in the same way. Thus, the game gives the player all the tools necessary for carving their path through the world, and it is on the player to use the tools given rather than having an overly handheld experience. It is an element that shows that Dark Souls isn't a game for everyone, and that's okay. If this were to be stripped down to allow for those not seeking this type of experience, then we would have a far less grounded and immersive experience on our hands for those of us that are. The lack of handholding only becomes an issue when we begin to discuss a great many systems where the game doesn't tell the player what the fuck is actually happening within some of the game's more important mechanics. Despite being a game which is very grounded aesthetically, it's still an action game where stats and mechanical clarity matters. The issue is that FromSoft has allowed this grounded ambiguity to seep into the more gamey aspects of the game's systems, such that specific information becomes simply obtuse for no substantive reason. For example, this is the description of what the ring does. There is no information on the ring regarding how much poise it grants. The numbers genuinely matter on whether a player is willing to use the item or not, and what a player must do to figure this out is look at their stats before and after equipping the ring. It is genuinely baffling that they simultaneously understand that stats matter enough to give the player a decently detailed stats screen while also giving zero indication on most items regarding the degree to which the stats will be affected. Now let's say for the sake of good faith argumentation that someone were to say that it's not a huge deal, seeing as the player can check the stats by equipping and unequipping, even if it is needlessly tedious. This is an argument that I could get behind to some extent if it were not for the effects of some rings and items that simply cannot be checked numerically by equipping and unequipping. Some examples are the Chloranthy Ring, Grass Crest Shield, and all other items that increase stamina regeneration are not communicated on their actual effectiveness at all, because stamina regeneration is not a stat on the status screen, leading a player to be forced to speculate on the effect strength based on the speed that the stamina bar moves. These items also do not communicate that stamina recovery effects stack. The red and blue tier stone rings do not communicate how much HP a player must have remaining to garner their effects, in addition to not telling the player the degree to which their damage and defense will rise once the threshold has been hit. The latter number can be tracked, but requires that the player to first reach the HP threshold, which is an absurd thing to expect from players. The covetous silver serpent ring and the symbol of avarice do not inform the player on how many more souls they will receive from enemy deaths, and just like the stamina regeneration items, do not inform the player that this ring and helmet stacks. Don't even get me started on the question of which effects stack additively or multiplicatively. Finally, the Ring of the Evil Eye does not have any indication to tell the player how much HP will be recovered per enemy killed, without explicit and thorough testing from the player. All of these examples, of which are but a small selection of the overall problem, showcase how unacceptable it is to have these kinds of effects in the game without clear signposting. Players are forced to build part of their character's equipment based on guesswork rather than informed and meaningful choices on the stats presented, leading to ambiguous vocabulary that can make a meek and useless effect sound incredible and vice versa. If your arguments against me have anything remotely to do with online wikis solving this, then I have nothing to say to you. Stat scaling ratings on weapons being letters rather than anything more substantive is also an issue in that same vein, but at least each weapon stat screen will differentiate base damage and added damage from stat scaling. Also, this doesn't just go for Dark Souls or its sequels either. It's a problem throughout many games in that devs do not show players the numbers when the numbers are the most important element to any system of this kind. Next up, Lower Undead Burg begins cramped and remains as such from beginning to end, including the boss's arena. Cramped spaces in Dark Souls showcase one of the game's smaller issues in that enemies' attacks have an unfair advantage against the player in the sense that the player's melee attacks bounce off of walls upon collision, but enemy melee attacks do not have this limitation. Lower Undead Burg is the perfect example of this issue, because enemies can and will body block the player with their collision box. One of the only ways to escape is to defeat the enemies causing this, because you cannot push them with a roll and you can only kick them. Oftentimes in these instances, the player will not escape the wall of enemies if there's an actual wall close enough for attacks to bounce off of. Attacks bouncing off of walls is not a strict negative, because it does feed into the grounded nature of the game to some extent, but when the player suffers this punishment without the enemies falling into the same camp, it harms the experience. In this regard, the importance is consistency. Either nothing should or everything should. In talking about this grounded aesthetic, don't assume that simply means realism. If it did, I wouldn't use colourful phrasing. I'd just say realism. The grounded sense that the game does extremely well also comes from the consistent challenge, the believability of the fantasy elements integrated with the medieval setting, NPC characterization, the world, lore and story being taken seriously, consistent tone, the actions that the player is capable of, they have the abilities of an average human with a few stretches here and there, the lack of handholding, and mechanical systems such as resistance, bonfires, and the interconnected level design. Some of these are more important than others for this aesthetic, but it all culminates to create it. Capra Demon is fought in an extremely narrow arena accompanied by two dogs. It is a fight which is described by me and many others as nothing more than a dice roll. Whether or not the player has the ability to beat it is all down to how lucky the player is with the demon and the dog's pathing and attacks each time the player walks through that fog door. This is because of the aforementioned body blocking that occurs with Capra Demon and the dogs, and can be made worse with the tiny arena. Dice roll is also an apt description, because the Capra Demon itself is a very standard fight that even newer players should not have an issue with after beating the Bell Gargoyles. Meaning if a player can get lucky with the dogs, they generally will win the fight. With the addition of a very arduous run back, Firelink Shrine being the safest bonfire to arrive from, and Undead Burg being slightly faster, yet more dangerous, Capra Demon is one of the most frustrating bosses in the game for many players. Getting to him is half the challenge, and then, once you're through the fog door, it's almost up to complete chance whether the enemy's pathing will give the player the victory or not. If you haven't grasped it yet, yes, this boss is badly designed. Adding basic enemies or additional bosses into boss fights without careful consideration and attention to detail is just a cheap way to increase difficulty that comes off as artificial and lacking any tact. It can and does work when done right, but as stated previously, Dark Souls is just not built for multi-enemy encounters despite being capable of facilitating them. Trudging along, we arrive in the depths, the key to which was dropped by the Capra Demon. It is a sewer-like area that introduces an enemy type that we shall become very accustomed to over these Soulsborne critiques: Basilisks. If you did not know that these little guys are called Basilisks, and you are confused why frog-looking creature is named after deadly reptile from mythology, just take a slightly closer look in the model and, yep, those massive things aren't their real eyes. It's a great design for a reptilian predator, genuinely. And that's about where the positives end, unfortunately, as these fuckers allow us to discuss the worst status effect in the game: Curse. Curse is a status effect dished out by two different enemies in Dark Souls. It builds up the same way that the others do, and once the bar is full, the player is killed instantly. Upon respawning, the player is cursed with a reduction of their maximum HP by 50%. One also cannot reverse hollowing or kindle, but they can damage the ghosts in New Londo ruins, so that's a plus. Removing Curse is done through the use of a consumable Purging Stone, or can be cured for the cost of 1 humanity by Ingwood in the New Londo ruins. When it comes to my criticism of this mechanic, I want it to be stated that I'm completely fine with the insta-kill. It's a good way of increasing the methods in which players can be defeated that do not directly affect their hit points, adding a good degree of variety while not stripping away a player's agency in avoiding said danger. The issues with this mechanic are all tied to the insane amount of punishment for dying to it that goes way beyond the death itself. It allows for a good discussion on the question of how punishing death should be. Death is a punishment for mistakes in that of itself. Runbacks to bosses can be seen as additive to this, and the loss of souls and humanity if those resources are not retrieved all contribute to the punishment that a player experiences for the average in-game death. I think that a good line for how punishing death should be is consistency, and clarity within the game itself, and aligning the level of mistake with the level of punishment relative to the average punishment dished out. Punishment for death is not prescriptively good or bad. Take LEGO games for example. Those games punish the player for dying by dropping a portion of one's collected studs, but near instantly respawns the player at maximum HP at the location of their death, or in the nearest safe location. The studs that were dropped on death can then be collected, only being permanently lost after a time limit, or if the player died in an environmental hazard. The fact that death in those games is extremely forgiving is not a bad thing. The experience that LEGO games are trying to offer is one which allows them to be accessible for people of all ages to enjoy without many roadblocks in their way. Death in those games work that way all the time. Context and consistency matters. If there were an enemy in a LEGO game that had an added unique punishment for death to where the player has to restart the entire level again, then that would be abhorrent because it betrays the player's understanding of what it means to die in the game. Taking this idea over to Dark Souls, a player cannot know that the Basilisk's attacks punish player deaths so drastically without experiencing it at least once. Death in Dark Souls is consistently punishing, with a slight variation in the time of boss runbacks as acceptable differences because players know where the bonfires are and they know they'll respawn at the last one rested. Curse suffers because it is no different from any other status ailment in how it builds up, and yet the punishment for death is so drastic and incongruent with the rest of the game before warping is unlocked, which is when it is most likely to affect the player. Forcing the player to leave the depths or the Great Hollow to be cured without having the ability to warp is insane. It can be deemed as simply and unarguably unfair. The Gaping Dragon is a monstrous beast with a gaping maw. The fight is not mechanically spectacular, nor does it generate any sort of sublime experience if we exclude the boss's opening cutscene. The dragon has a large health pool in comparison to the average DPS that a player can generally deal at that point, so it becomes a fight that is more about attrition. Holding out while dealing as much damage as one can without taking damage from its very telegraphed attacks. One factor unique to this fight that adds a small layer of interest is the channeler that attacks the player with ranged attacks from outside the arena. This channeler is another mini-boss enemy that can be found and killed to remove it as a variable from the Gaping Dragon fight, rewarding thorough exploration through the depths and punishing a player that rushes to the fog door. There isn't much else to say on this fight really. There are 3 dragon bosses in Dark Souls and only one of them survives all scrutiny. And needless to say, the Gaping Dragon isn't it. It's the most average boss a boss can be. Killing this strange entity grants the player the key to Blighttown, a shantytown built around the base of Lordran, left only with Undead Burg's runoff. The area's design reflects this with rickety and oddly shapen pathways that connect different huts and locations within this zone. Blighttown has 2 bonfires, one in the shantytown above, the other below in the poison swamp. This area itself could be considered a boss with how much care was taken to making it an experience to fight through, while also containing fantastic visual storytelling regarding why and how the town came to be, with the game's use of verticality as a base for world building. It is a town created by the lowest of the low. The gods, scholars, and most devout reside in the highest peaks of Anor Londo and Duke's archives. Below that is Undead Burg, the more well-developed and prosperous settlement for the common people. Lower Undead Burg is home to thieves and the less fortunate. Blighttown is where the sick and poverty-ridden built their way to survive in the land's underbelly, with a realm of lava and demons just below them. All of this reinforces the grounded aesthetic of the game, as these areas connect in a manner that is logically consistent and builds the world layer by layer. Blighttown can be a frustrating experience during a player's first run, not due to bad design, but rather through it being a location that can be a maze to get through for the first time, along with the toxic and poison status effects that most enemies inflict in this area. Now that that is mentioned, we can finally use the purple moss clumps we entered into evidence previously. The method of giving these to the player naturally as drops within Darkroot Garden is an example of fucking genius game design. These items will end up in players' inventories if they are to explore Darkroot Garden and enable a player to have a much easier time in Blighttown, a lot of the time without the player even noticing. This is another feat of Dark Souls that would be impossible if not for the lack of handholding. The entire reason why a player can have these items during their time in Blighttown is because Darkroot Garden is ambiguous in whether it is the next location along the critical path or not. As previously stated, players tend to explore the garden thinking it's the correct way to go, and that leads them to acquire these purple moss clumps inconspicuously. It is a subtle yet masterful way of having the game provide an experience which has the gamey element of getting the item you need right before you need to use it, without it feeling contrived because of how detached Darkroot Garden and Blighttown are from each other. The game does this in many instances. Another prime example is giving a player an alluring skull above the iron boar encounter in the Undead Parish. The player is not told how to use it to beat the boar, but a player can use their intuition to lead the boar into the fiery pit below. The swamp below the town inflicts poison when walked on, but the level does place patches of ground that a player can path between to avoid this status effect. We're going to get very well acquainted with poison swamps by the end of this video series. This leads us to the fight with Quelaag. Quelaag is a spider monster corrupted and morphed by the Chaos Flame. She is wreathed in flames and such is immune to fire damage. She has a very large variety of attacks including area denial, melee, jumping, and a high damage close range AoE that prevents players from sticking too close to her during the entire fight. The fight rewards paying close attention to what Quelaag is doing because of how the attacks are telegraphed. Area denial mechanics suffer drastically if there is not proper care taken by devs to create a fight that incorporates it without harming the overall experience. If Quelaag required careful positioning to avoid her attacks, as well as a player needing to factor in the environmental hazards she creates, then a player would become overwhelmed. Quelaag is designed to be mostly secondary to her area denial mechanics, so that a player does not have to focus on both. My examples are her highly telegraphed attacks being elementary to dodge, as the challenge is not in avoiding these attacks alone, but avoiding them while also keeping clear of the lava. This is taken to the highest degree with her close range AoE, that can be a one-shot kill for a low HP, under-leveled, or low fire resistance player. It is a very clearly telegraphed attack, with Quelaag's human figure slowly drooping onto the spider's head, giving a player ample time to react to it. If a player runs away in the direction of lava, then they are far more likely to be defeated. She's a pretty good fight all in all, testing positioning rather than how well a player can press circle or B at the right time. With her gone and the second bell successfully rung, the door to Sen's fortress is unlocked, with the only challenge left for a player in this area to return to the Undead Parish safely. Before that though, we need to discuss another major topic. I've been discussing the bell in Undead Parish and the bell in Blighttown as the first and second bell respectively. In reality, a player can ring each of these bells in any order. This is much easier to do if the player starts the run with the Master Key, but is possible for all players. There isn't much reason to, seeing as the areas and enemies in Dark Souls scale linearly in the order I've been discussing them, but it's good that the option is there. The Master Key is the item that truly opens up Dark Souls 1's early game. It not only allows players to progress in any order, but it also allows players to receive items from areas like Blighttown, Darkroot Garden, and Undead Parish right from the off without needing to ever visit Undead Burg. One of the great elements that it enables, which can be done without the Master Key with a longer trek, is the ability to skip the entirety of the depths and the upper section of Blighttown. This isn't entirely obvious from the Master Key's description, but it truly adds a lot of choice in how the world is carved through. My greatest example is a video by a channel called RT Game, titled Beating Dark Souls by Completely Stupid Means. It showcases what is possible with the Master Key in creating a unique playthrough. From Firelink Shrine, RT Game traverses to Ash Lake to acquire the Dragon Greatsword and Dragon Headstone. Those are the stupid means described in the title. The title assumes that RT Game is beating Dark Souls using unconventional methods that the devs didn't predict or expect. Meanwhile, this is just the Master Key doing exactly what it's designed to do: create variety and player agency with how one chooses to make their playthrough their own. This isn't a slight against RT for any kind of clickbait either. Making runs feel unique or quote-unquote stupid is entirely the point of the mechanic. It is a brilliant addition to Dark Souls, and it would not be the same game without the option to take this at the start. The world and level design of Dark Souls perfectly combines linear on-rails design with an open-ish world to create an interconnected Metroidvania with so many choices and options open to the player in how they choose to engage with it. A discussion on Quelaag's sister can wait. Leaving Blighttown can too. On the other end of the swamp from Quelaag is the entrance to the Great Hollow and Ash Lake. I don't have much to say on these areas as they are entirely optional and only serve to house the Dragon Covenant and the ending to Siegmeyer's questline, but the discovery of Ash Lake can be a powerful experience for many players. I just wanted to give them a passing mention as I am trying to be thorough, and the visuals of Ash Lake are going to come up a couple of times in the later games. Exiting Blighttown involves the use of the water wheel elevator and a series of ladders, ultimately connecting Blighttown to the Valley of Drakes. The only criticism I have for this section is how the elevator is very inconsistent when trying to get onto the first upper platform. It sometimes, plain and simply, kills the player when trying to get off. There doesn't seem to be any real mistake that a player makes to have this occur, it's just inconsistently dysfunctional. Before we move on to Miyazaki's Funhouse, we'll take a short detour and return to the Undead Asylum. This area can be reached once the elevator connecting Undead Parish to Firelink Shrine is unlocked. The area is entirely optional and contains a great many secrets and important events that facilitate more optional content. This area is easy to miss and can only be found via exploring Firelink Shrine, even though the Crestfallen Warrior does give the player a slight nudge. Upon re-entry into Northern Undead Asylum, the player is greeted by a few torch-wielding hollows and the doors to Asylum Demon's area are still open. Out here is also where the player can find Snuggly the Crow. Snuggly is a trader that doesn't have any UI or menus, but rather must have an item dropped into her nest which converts into another item upon quitting and reloading the game. Snuggly allows some bonus items for players who are willing to look up her trades, and that's all there is to it. There's no intuitive way to figure out what items are tradable for what without using a wiki or guide, making it a fine mechanic for additional playthroughs, but generally not accessible for anyone playing blind. I tend to go back and forth on whether this is an issue or not, and I've settled at it being mostly fine, as all items that can be received are not unique. Except a spell received from trading Manus' boss soul, and I'd prefer if that spell was accessible without Snuggly, but seeing as it's such a late game item that can only be received if the player enters the DLC, which is near impossible to figure out how to enter in blind anyway, it's less of an issue of Snuggly and more so leads to a critique of the DLC's insane entry requirements. We have a bit of game left before we discuss that, however. Thus, the only critique I have remaining for Snuggly is the need to quit out and reload, warp, or die to complete the trade. Dark Souls has several interactions and events that trigger upon loading into an area fully, so quitting and reloading becomes a need during many instances as it is much faster than the other two options. Interactions like this include, but are not limited to, spawning the Golden Golem after the death of the Hydra in Darkroot Garden, spawning NPCs after certain events have taken place, retrieving drops from non-respawning enemies if they happen to die via falling into a chasm, and trading with Snuggly as previously mentioned. Having this as a method to run certain events is fine in concept, but removes a layer of verisimilitude as players tend to default to gamifying this by simply quitting and immediately reloading, which wasn't what the devs intended this to be used for. The reliance on this also makes quitting and reloading have a few exploitative side effects. From harmless ones like quitting during door animations to save a few seconds during a speed run, to the ability to quit out on Sen's Fortress's internal boulder section to skip half of the fucking area. One must go out of their way to learn some of these, sure, but they aren't exactly exploits that require a lot of game knowledge, physical dexterity, or time investment. The worst offender is that the Pisakas in Duke's archives do not go up the stairs anymore after a death or quit out and reload, instead just sitting idly in a small room below the Snake Men. This is a clear issue, and I think that the experience would improve if the world state and character state were saved and reloaded exactly as they were left, and these events that require reloading the game were triggered some other way. The Stray Demon fight begins when the floor of the Asylum Demon's arena collapses from underneath the player. Sucks for any player who didn't sit at the bonfire in the room to the right of the entrance, huh? The Stray Demon is a visual clone of the Asylum Demon and can be spotted within the first few seconds of a new playthrough. Despite being a visual clone of the Asylum Demon, they fight rather differently, with the Stray Demon having a staff-like weapon over a great hammer. This difference plays out during combat as the Stray Demon pelts the ground in front of it with magical explosions after the majority of its attacks. This boss is incredibly easy to chip down when the player positions behind it, such that it is more of a time sink to complete, rather than any real challenge to be overcome. The boss isn't greatly designed, especially seeing as the reward for beating it is immense in comparison to the challenge. Killing the Stray Demon is not worth a fucking Titanite slab. The asset reuse discussion is an interesting one, but seeing as this fight is different enough from the original Asylum Demon, we can launch that discussion once we fight the third Asylum Demon. The rest of the Northern Undead Asylum is littered with hollows, black knights, and a fight with Oscar if the player decided not to kill him during the tutorial. It is also here that we obtain the item that we need to enter the Painted World, which leads us to Sen's Fortress. I have no idea who Sen is, but he's a fuck. This area is full of traps and environmental hazards. It also introduces the Snake Men and Mimics, the latter of those two being a monster that appears as a chest, but eats the player if opened. When caught by a Mimic, the Mimic's animation for eating the player character counts as an enemy grab attack, an attack type that removes all control from the player for a limited time. All grab attacks are different in how they interact with the player. Most are simply high damage moves, like the Mimic's grab, which is generally an instant kill, unless the player has high defense or high HP. But some, like Gwyn and Super Ornstein's grab, tosses the player horizontally while also doing damage. Grabs are generally very well telegraphed and need to be because they take the flow out of a fight and can be extremely frustrating to deal with. When it comes to grab attacks, the topic of hitboxes comes up a lot, so let's explore them. Hitboxes are a standard convention of nearly all video games. They are generally invisible basic shapes like cylinders, circles, and, well, boxes, and upon collision with each other trigger specific actions to whatever context they're in. For example, In Dark Souls, when the player's weapon hitbox collides with an enemy's body hitbox, then the calculation is run for damage against the enemy's hit points. Because these invisible detectors are basic shapes, there are possibilities for certain attacks, objects, and enemies to not have the 3D model perfectly aligned with the hitbox used. Fortunately, Dark Souls is among the best of what can be done when good hitboxes are carefully designed. They are tight, and we will continue to see this come to a head as we progress through the games. The only area of hitbox design that Dark Souls sometimes has issues with is grab attacks. There are instances where the player will clearly dodge the attack, but the hitbox for the grab lingers for longer than expected, and suddenly the player character model will snap into the animation for being grabbed. Even when the hitbox of a grab is slightly off, it can still look very strange as the character snaps into place. They aren't all terrible, most of them are just as tight as to be expected from Dark Souls. It's just not quite perfect. Sen's Fortress as a whole is an area that can be grueling on a first playthrough, but once learned, can be traversed from beginning to end without setbacks. To be fair, that sentence can be applied to all of Dark Souls 1, but I think it's especially true for Sen's Fortress, as one single mistake is often enough to send the player right back to the start. The game does not give the player any bonfires for the area until they've overcome every trap, and even then, the bonfire is decently hidden. Touching upon the Mimic once more, its illusory properties are done with an immense amount of restraint and care to make it far more fair than would ever be expected with this kind of mechanic in an enemy. The first time that a player can ever come across one of these enemies is in Sen's Fortress, and that's already a fantastic method of subtle guidance. The entire location is full of traps, rolling boulders, and swinging axes. So when the player sees this chest, which is in the middle of a room, placed strangely and diagonally, unlike most other chests prior that are usually against and roughly parallel to some kind of wall, massive red flags immediately emanate from its presence and its location. Don't get me wrong, this doesn't make every player impervious to falling victim to this creature, but rather it decreases the number of players who would have otherwise, and may also change the reaction of those who do die from it from, wow, that was fucking cheap, to, I should have seen that coming. Emphasis on the word may. Not every player will react in the exact same way, but what the designers have done to introduce this fiend into the world of Dark Souls is the best case scenario. From here onwards, mimics only appear in zones located physically higher than Sen's Fortress. All mimics also have a few more subtle tells that they aren't real chests, like the chain pointing in reverse, and the player can see the chest breathing if they look close enough. These tells are now less important because most players will begin to attack every chest they see before they open them from here on out. All in all, in terms of gimmicky trap encounters, mimics in Dark Souls 1 are done the best that enemy type can be done in a way that remains fair. Sen's Fortress caps off with a fight against the Iron Golem. Iron Golems are a staple of many renditions of fantasy settings, and it makes sense that this metal construct would be the guardian of Anor Londo, and it fits well into the setting of Sen's Fortress too. This fight is among the likes of Gaping Dragon in the sense there's a non-respawning enemy outside the boss room that will attack the player with ranged attacks during the fight if they are not dealt with separately before going through the fog door. That's not the only interesting variable at play during the fight, however. The Iron Golem is heavily staggered after enough hits or damage from the player, as a giant metal construct would if it had a person hitting their legs over and over. After enough damage has been dealt while it's staggered, it falls over backwards. The interesting part about this is if the Iron Golem does not have a floor to fall onto, i.e. the side of the bridge, it will collapse and fall off of the arena, killing it instantly. I stated before that FromSoft knew not to lean on the action elements of Dark Souls to create the experience, and this is the exact type of shit that I'm talking about. The Iron Golem isn't a mechanically complex fight, but it interacts with the world that it is in a way that goes against standard conventions of action games without being bullshit or badly designed. Convention states that a boss fight ought to be an epic clash against difficult opponents which test your skill as a player, not destroyed quickly and realistically as a direct consequence of their size, and Dark Souls is all the better for it. Dark Souls has tests of skill. We met that in the fight with the Bell Gargoyles, and we shall be discussing one of the best examples extremely soon with Ornstein and Smough as the next boss fight on the critical path. If the entire game were made up of these fights, then Dark Souls would lose the value it gains from having such a diverse swath of fights that don't all fit into the same conventional mold. The same would be the case if every fight were unconventional and we had no fights that tested our skill as players. A world without Artorias would be a dark one indeed. The contrast is what makes the experience of Dark Souls 1 as unique and powerful as it is. This brings us to Anor Londo, home of the gods and the most visually splendorous location in the game that we've seen so far. A neat bit of trivia is that Anor Londo may have very well been named based on a language created by J.R.R. Tolkien, with Anor meaning sun and Lond meaning landlocked haven. It's no wonder Miyazaki also decided to create a fantasy story about a ring. Anor Londo unfortunately does not start off strong. As we get to the palace, we must first complete the Rafters section. The narrative implication of everything leading up to the second Anor Londo bonfire is that the player character is breaking into the palace. That's the point of the Rafter and Archer sections. We get past the raised bridge via the rafters of the church, and get past the locked front door using an open window near a windowsill around the side of a building. The former of these two sections is one of the worst parts of the entire game. To start, figuring out that one of the buttresses can and must be walked on is very unclear, as all similar structures prior have simply been part of the terrain and not a walkable surface. The only way a player can figure this out is luck, seeing an online message from another player, or looking it up. It is not intuitive whatsoever. Once the player has overcome that hurdle, they are then forced to saunter atop the rafters of the building in the hopes they do not get knocked off by the painting guardians. The idea of breaking into Anor Londo is lost on this section, because why would guardians of the painted world of Ariamis be sitting atop the fucking rafters? It makes sense for them being on the ground floor and the top floor we enter via the broken window. But what are they guarding up on the rafters? What paintings are there to guard up there? It would be much more apparent of a breaking into Anor Londo idea if no enemies were up there, and when a player traverses the rafters, they just see a horde of enemies standing guard on the ground floor as foreshadowing for when they decide to enter the painting later. The second section that showcases this break-in thematic is the Archer section. Silver Knights on the windowsills of the palace fire massive spear-sized arrows as the player attempts to walk up another buttress to reach the broken window that allows the player to enter the palace. These spear-like arrows knock players prone, leading to instant death by falling into a chasm if hit. I've never had an issue with this section because I've always just done what's required to beat it, which is just to sprint up the buttress and allow the Silver Knight on the right-hand side to kill itself after it pulls out its sword. That being the case, I won't just disregard the fact that many players find this section just as, if not more tedious than the Rafters section, so let's explore it. Going through many threads and videos on this section, I've concluded that the issues that players have with it are related to their playstyle. For every thread about being stuck at the archers, there's an equal and opposite thread about not understanding why other players struggle with it. Dark Souls as a game subtly encourages new players to play slowly and methodically, armoring and shielding up to knuckle down against all enemies, as opposed to the glass cannon builds that more experienced players tend to run with. This slow playstyle is what makes the Archer section as infamous as it is online. If a player tries to do this section methodically, they can easily become overrun by the dangers. Because of this, I hesitate to criticize the section as a whole for it, nor would I say that the players who struggle are at fault either. This section is simply a learning curve for some new players to learn that a singular approach won't work for all cases, and when looking at it from that perspective, it works quite well. Once all these sections are completed, we arrive within Anor Londo proper. The palace is where Anor Londo truly shines, with Silver Knights as great basic enemies that come with a variety of types, numbers, and locations. Before we progress though, I would like to begin discussion on a mechanic or two that I've mentioned in passing. Blocking, backstabbing, and by extension, circle-strafing. Blocking is an action that can be performed by any weapon held in both hands and with shields. Blocking reduces damage when hit, by an amount determined by the block percentage of the weapon or shield in use. When damage is blocked, the character blocking loses stamina as a cost, with that amount being determined based on a formula that uses the attack stamina damage rate and the block stability stat. In practice, this action is an extremely useful part of a character's defensive toolkit. Having said this, blocking is ill-advised against bosses because a lot of bosses' attack strings will very quickly drain the player character of their stamina, leaving them defenseless. It's a good addition to the game that allows players to have their sword and board builds, a very viable way to play the game and one of the best entry-level builds for new players. A very basic way to look at defensive actions in Dark Souls is blocking as low risk, low reward, rolling as medium risk, medium reward, and parrying as high risk, high reward. This phrase will come back into play when we discuss parrying, but in essence, this is how the game runs upon a surface level view of the systems and is, probably, how these systems ought to function. Even after a lot of thought, I'm still not concrete on that statement yet though. It would take some convincing to solidify that opinion. Backstabbing occurs against the vast majority of humanoid enemies in Dark Souls. If the player is directly behind and up close to most enemies, they can press the light attack button to perform a backstab. Backstab is a locked-in animation that deals critical damage against an enemy with full iframes, the same as opening doors or chests. The enemy is also knocked onto the ground. This system works fine to reward player positioning, but it has a couple of fatal flaws. The first is the ability to chain backstabs together. An example of this will be on screen. The game just lets me backstab Havel over and over. This issue comes about because of how enemies fall onto the ground and slowly get back up. Don't get me wrong, it cannot be done with all enemies, nor is it always intuitive where to stand to do it. But the fact that it's possible at all is an issue. The devs even know that this is an issue because they do try to account for it. See how at some point, Havel snaps to instantly face me. This is a feature in the game if the player attempts to chain backstabs too much, but it makes little to no difference because it is not consistent at all with preventing this strategy, especially seeing as after he snapped to look at me, I just parried him and returned to chaining backstabs. I don't know how a developer would go about fixing something like this without simply removing backstabbing. But you know what, on that topic, I'll simply bide my time, because one game did manage to fix it without removing it. Now, why did I decide to talk about blocking and backstabbing in conjunction? They seem like polar opposites. Well, it's time to talk about circle-strafing. Circle-strafing is a common strategy in Dark Souls whereby the player holds up their shield to block and simply circles an enemy up close. The blocking isn't necessary, but it does make this strategy easier. What happens is that the enemy will track the player for a brief time, the enemy will eventually make an attack, and when the attack is blocked, a player has the time to get behind the enemy to perform a backstab. Sometimes the attack from the enemy won't even hit, making circle-strafing even easier. This simple yet effective strategy does not work for bosses as they cannot be backstabbed, but is great when facing a singular humanoid enemy. It is also extremely cheesy and should probably not be in the game. It works so well because I don't think getting behind an enemy for a backstab was intended for moment-to-moment combat, but rather a way to take out an enemy that a player manages to sneak up on. It may have also been made with PvP in mind, as other human players may roll into a position that allows them to be punished with a backstab. When this mechanic is given so many upsides over regular combat, of course, many players are going to abuse that. It's not as bad as chaining backstabs because this at least forces a player to engage with an enemy to some extent, and certain attacks, like grabs, can go through whether the player is blocking or not. Just talking about this issue makes me excited for when we get to discuss it again in the game that fixed backstabs. But enough of that, we were in Anor Londo. So without any further delay, Ornstein and Smough is one of the best fights in the entire game. It may have even been number one if not for Artorias. This is the only true multi-boss fight in the game. Yes, Capra has the dogs and Bell Gargoyles can have the player fighting both at once, but Ornstein and Smough, or ONS for short, is the only fight where it starts with both bosses and the player must kill both. It is also the only boss in the game which has two phases. This is a fight that fits perfectly into the game, yet also feels so ahead of its time in relation to all the other bosses. As I've said, boss fights with multiple enemies need to be carefully designed because Dark Souls is built to facilitate single enemy encounters more than any other type of fight. ONS is the gold standard for what can be achieved when multi-boss fights are carefully designed to fit within the mechanics of Dark Souls. The methods that were used to reach this in the design relate to ONS having opposite, yet complementary movesets. Smough is huge and slow, whereas Ornstein is quick and small, while also being the only one of them with ranged options. They are designed with each other in mind in this regard, seen by the fact that if the player focuses Ornstein first, they will generally always have an idea where Smough is because of the camera shake, sound effects, and his size. Ornstein can also be separated from Smough because of their difference in speeds. If the player focuses on Smough first, his size can be used to block off Ornstein from being as oppressive, along with having attacks that are far more easily dodged than Ornstein's because of the longer telegraphs. These two also operate at different melee ranges. Smough may be slow, but he has much longer reach than Ornstein, who needs to be right up close to the player before he uses his melee attacks. Combine all of this with an arena that is full of pillars which allows the player safer healing locations, and we have a great duo boss on our hands. It's also really telling how good and versatile the fight is when taking a look at the general player base, seeing as there's a pretty even split between those who deal with Ornstein first and vice versa. From what I've seen and experienced, it's more of a player thing and less of a build thing. I will generally always kill Ornstein first because that's just how I like to play. I find killing Smough first to be much more difficult. Yet many players feel the exact same but in reverse, finding Smough a lot easier and killing him first every time. Both second phases are pretty good, not as good as phase 1 but still well designed overall because of the maintained fair movesets that don't gain a whole lot of new mechanics across phases. The only criticism I have for ONS is how Ornstein's dash is sometimes strange with how it animates. He'll sometimes charge it up, then start walking normally, and then instantly within one frame snap into the dashing animation, which can be a bit frustrating. It seems more like an AI issue to me than any kind of bug or glitch. It's very rare but not unheard of for enemies in Dark Souls 1 to have AI that leads their pathing in strange directions or snapping into certain actions. Just like camera issues, enemy AI works well 99.9% of the time, but those 0.1% of times that it does happen are unnoticed. Once ONS are gone, we get the Lord Vessel from a nice chest, which can be placed in Firelink Altar to reveal the locked off areas of the Tomb of the Giants, Duke's Archives, and Lost Izalith. It also unlocks warping from bonfire to bonfire once acquired. So without further ado, let's explore that. The sentence you will often hear in regards to this mechanic is that warp comes in once the world of Dark Souls has become too large to not include it, or some other variation of that statement. I've even heard the phrase that warp is introduced at the perfect time. The questions that I want to pose are, how large is too large of a world? If warp was introduced 1 hour later or 1 hour earlier, would that be bad? What if it were introduced after the first Lord Soul was found? What if it was a New Game Plus only mechanic? What if it was after the bells had been rung? What if we started with it? Why out of all of these infinite options, is the end of Anor Londo the perfect time for it to be introduced? I stated back in the Undead Parish that warping is introduced when the interconnectedness takes a dip and the world becomes too large, thus the interesting shortcuts and pathways through the world would become a long and arduous journey, if not for warping at that point. An interconnected world like Dark Souls is built out like a spiral, when early on the shortcuts are short elevator rides and other types of connecting pathways. If interconnectedness were to be added to the later game sections and warping were removed, then players would have to travel using a great many shortcuts to get from one side of the world to the other. That, or whole areas would have to connect distant locations together, like the Valley of Drakes not being a fully fledged area, but rather an intermittent zone that connects Darkroot Basin, Blighttown, and New Londo ruins. Okay, so why Anor Londo? Well, Anor Londo is the first of many dead ends in Dark Souls 1. Because areas become so distant that they cannot be connected via shortcuts as I stated, this leads to areas with dead ends filling up the latter half of the game, Anor Londo being that first big dead end. Anor Londo was supposed to connect to Sense Fortress in real time, but FromSoft felt that the majesty of Anor Londo would be better revealed through a cutscene, so it became detached from the rest of the world. To leave or enter, a player must interact with a cutscene, and this may be what made Anor Londo into an area with a clear start and end point. Having the first big dead-end area introduce warping is the perfect method in which to do this, because it allows the interconnected nature of Dark Souls to not become a hindrance with a world too large to facilitate it. If it were not introduced to Anor Londo, backtracking would be strenuous because there are no alternative paths or shortcuts. The large level would just be the same in reverse. I would personally prefer warping to be a New Game Plus mechanic if it meant more connections and areas, but the game was limited in scope by its budget and time constraints. Hell, Lost Izalith wasn't even finished. So that's why warping, but how warping? The warp mechanic can be done at any bonfire in the game apart from a couple of hyper-specific circumstances, and it allows the player to fast travel to several specific bonfires in the game. These warpable bonfires include all Firekeeper bonfires and some other important locations like the Undead Parish bonfire next to Andre and the entrance to the DLC. It works as any fast travel system naturally would, but I do have a few issues with the choices of which bonfires can be travelled to. First off, why are the Darkroot Garden or Basin bonfires not warpable? Them and many other intermittent bonfires between key areas are not warpable, but seeing as the only close bonfire to Darkroot is Andre's, it increases the travel time substantially in a way that only serves to hinder the experience. I understand that having all bonfires be warpable is a mistake. Limiting the bonfires that the player can travel to allows the interconnected world to maintain its function during gameplay, causing a player to meaningfully interact with it post-Lord Vessel. When the game came out, even fewer bonfires were warpable than there are now, and I appreciate that increase in quality of life where it makes sense. But even with those additions, a player cannot just ignore connecting areas by traveling to the exact bonfire they need to get to. This is a good thing. But having no warpable bonfire to easily access the innermost parts of Darkroot Garden is a blight, seeing as it becomes one of the most returned to areas outside of Firelink fucking Shrine. Darkroot is home of Havel the Rock, Moonlight Butterfly, Sif, and the entrance to the DLC, which requires going to Darkroot on at least 2 separate occasions. Most other areas need only be visited once during any given playthrough. Secondly, why are bonfires still warpable after being turned off? I get that this is probably allowed for quality of life reasons, but it just seems so odd that a completely useless bonfire is still warpable no matter if its Firekeeper is alive or not. Is this the case because of quality of life, or was it just not thought about during development? I like it from a gameplay and ease of use perspective somewhat, but it's bizarre from a world building perspective, especially for a game as grounded and punishing as Dark Souls. Lastly, and the most egregious issue, why the fuck is the warpable bonfire to get to all locations in and surrounding Blighttown the one bonfire which is hidden by an illusory wall? Okay, it's time for that illusory wall discussion that I promised earlier. Illusory walls are a mechanic that sound great on paper, but it hampers the experience of Dark Souls in practice, especially when it is connected to a mechanic as core to the game as bonfires. The developers introduced warping because they knew the world had become too large for the constant usage of shortcuts. So why then is the warping mechanic's whole purpose thrown down into the depths for the one area that would be one of the furthest from any other bonfire at the point that warping is unlocked? The Demon Ruins or Blighttown's second bonfire ought to be the warpable one because it is far more likely that a player will find them. Illusory walls are generally not criticized by the player base because they are often found by players who then leave notes to tell others about the wall. If a player is not online or simply not looking at messages, then their chances of finding these hidden areas are extremely low. Keep in mind that if one is playing on console, they have to pay a subscription fee to Sony, Microsoft, or Nintendo for online experiences, including the ability to see player messages. There is no tutorial or obvious tell for a wall being illusory either. The mimics work well as secret enemies because of their subtle tells, and the indirect tutorial is given to the player in Sense Fortress, so that one can determine which chests are real or not without just knowing beforehand or seeing a player message from that point on. This is how secrets like this are supposed to be done, especially when taking into effect that the Daughter of the Chaos Bonfire is secretive. They should be easier to distinguish than mimics. I'm fine with illusory walls hiding actual secrets. Illusory walls that hide the Great Hollow are perfectly fine the way they are. The issue is when important gameplay elements like bonfires are hidden from players as if they should be secrets. And this happens twice. Before we start taking Lord Souls, we should probably cap off Anor Londo. Gwyn's daughter, Guinevere, can be attacked and revealed to be fake. When this happens, we see the truth of what Anor Londo truly is. The whole colour palette changes as we see Anor Londo is not the last bastion of grandeur within Lordran, but rather a dark, desolate and abandoned city. Along with changing most of the area's enemy placement, this reveal also allows the player to fight Gwyndolin, the other boss of Anor Londo. The other way that a player can gain access to Gwyndolin is through entering into the Darkmoon Covenant. Even for a fight against a mage, the fight is mechanically uninteresting. The player runs at him while avoiding projectiles, beats him up, then he teleports away and repeat. The arena is pretty neat, and I recommend Dark Souls Dissected episode 12 by Illusory Wall if you want to know how it was made. It's interesting how things like this end up being created. Slight spoiler for that video, the infinite hallway isn't infinite. It has an end that 99.999% of players won't ever get to by playing naturally before Gwyndolin's microscopic health pool is depleted. Overall, Gwyndolin is one of those experiential bosses that is all about the journey and the feel of fighting him over any mechanical prowess. I'm not prepared to say that the fight is bad, it functions, but it definitely is not stellar. The final landmark of Anor Londo is the painted world of Ariamis. The development story behind this zone is that it was supposed to be a part of the critical path, but time constraints led the devs to use this area as a hidden zone and filled it with enemies that were to be on the cutting room floor. The area has many hidden areas, items, and pathways, and is one of the best self-contained levels in Dark Souls. The Painted World's bonfire is also one of the two that cannot be warped from, leaving the player stuck in the painting until they escape. While this sort of thing would usually end in creating an issue of soft-locking the player, the game does something interesting to remove this problem. When the player meets Priscilla at the end of the painting, she tells them how to leave and doesn't attack on sight. The player then has the choice of whether to attack her to begin the boss fight, or walk right past her and leave her alone. This isn't revolutionary in the world of video games, but for the world of Dark Souls, it comes out of left field after every other creature in this world has been so hostile outside of NPCs. Priscilla's design is intriguing, being a mix of both human and dragon, which has, implications. For those who decided to kill her, the heartless bastards, the fight is very unique, with Priscilla going invisible to fight the player. The great aspect of this mechanic is that, even when invisible, she leaves behind footprints in the snow that allow the player to continue their offensive and consistently get a feel for where she is in the arena. It is a fantastic way of improving her unique mechanics to maintain a sense of fairness in the fight. Dark Souls combat only works so far as the player knows what is going on at any given time, so mechanics like invisibility need supplemental additions like this to fit into the framework of Souls combat. While we're still in the general area of Anor Londo, we may as well discuss one of the endgame areas too, Duke's Archives and Crystal Cave. Duke's Archives is special in that it's the only zone in the game where dying is the method by which the player progresses. There are, of course, speedrun skips to progress without dying, but death to Seath is the intended path forward. It is counterintuitive and can feel a bit like bullshit, especially seeing as the player will still lose their souls upon death. Forcing player death must be done carefully, especially when the player is already in the endgame, where souls can be gained and lost in the tens of thousands. Usually the best way to achieve forced loss, while not betraying the player's trust, is to give them a chance at winning, even if extremely low. The reason why that wouldn't work here is that it may give the player the impression that they are underleveled in some way, which is not the case. The player is then imprisoned within the deepest parts of Duke's archives next to the only other bonfire locked off from the warping system. This zone is littered with snake people that release the Pisakas, which add to the experience a lot because of how unique the encounter is. Enemies in Dark Souls are generally stationary until aggroed, so having an enemy with some kind of scripted action outside of combat is in such stark contrast to the rest of the game. The area isn't the most complex before we move into the library, but the design of the library is where this area goes above and beyond compared to all other late game areas. All 4 Lord Soul areas each have their own gimmick which tries to provide a unique experience. Lost Izalith has lava, New Londo Ruins hides half its area underwater, has the unhittable ghosts, and can be completed before the acquisition of the Lord Vessel. Tomb of the Giants is dark as fuck, and the Duke's Archives in Crystal Caves has the rotating staircases and invisible pathways. Some of these gimmicks are done better than others, and some are downright poor ideas, but they all succeeded in making each late game area more distinct from one another when coupled with each area's very distinct atmosphere. The library seems like the best time to introduce a discussion on another of the game's overarching systems: magic. More specifically, sorceries, miracles, pyromancy, attunement, and the memory system. Spells and miracles have stat requirements to be equipped, just like weapons, and each has different effects and properties. Pyromancy is unique in the fact that it has no stat requirement, and rather scales with the pyromancy flame required for casting. Spells and miracles are very similar to each other in how they fundamentally operate, being essentially the equivalent of strength and dex for mage builds, scaling off of intelligence and faith respectively. Spells and miracles also require different equipment to be cast. The game limits spell casting by giving each spell, miracle, and pyromancy a set number of uses that restore at bonfires or upon death. This is the memory system. The game also limits the number of spells that can be equipped at once, determined by the player's attunement stat. The reason for these limitations is to try to offset the benefits received from having powerful ranged attacks and other unique effects. I'll put it bluntly, magic is broken in Dark Souls 1. Don't get me wrong, magic builds as a whole aren't broken per se. Enemies just cannot account for ranged attacks because enemies are designed in this game to be fought in melee. This is also why bow builds aren't real. Bows aren't feasible for any builds outside of bow-only challenge runs, specifically played to be a highly challenging experience similar to Soul Level 1 runs. Whole enemy groups and mini-bosses fall to magic attacks before enemies can even get close to the player in many instances. This is made even worse because of the simple combat of Dark Souls relying on enemy movesets to allow the gameplay to be remotely interesting. There are a few saving graces that allow magic to not make mage builds overpowered as a whole. Bosses, generally, are far less susceptible to magic because of their ability to close gaps faster, punish mistakes harder, and many have the random magic resistance that I've spoken about earlier. To be frank, the random magic res on some bosses may have been added to nerf magic builds, as the actual gameplay of casting spells is not the game's strong suit. Another boon for mage mechanics is that magic builds generally cannot rely solely on spells, but end up requiring a melee weapon in conjunction with their arcane arsenal. That, in large part, is what makes these builds worthwhile within the context of the combat system, despite spell-only builds existing and being less broken than spellsword builds. And this is where the memory system succeeds as well. A player must manage their spell usage as they are not infinite or replenishable with ease. This system also allows each spell to have its own balance through the number of uses per spell rather than an overall total. This system also ensures that using one spell does not encroach on the ability of a player to use another because they all have their usage limits that do not cross over in any way. The fact that magic builds exist at all is good overall. Build diversity is one of the greatest strengths of the game, and Dark Souls would be worse without them. In conclusion on magic, all of the systems bind together within the context of Dark Souls to create a fantastic system for magic builds to take advantage of within the framework of Souls combat. Issues lie within magic only so far as AI's lack of ability to account for the usage of powerful ranged attacks. This issue is a large problem with the balance of magical attacks, but does not affect how well the systems surrounding these attacks are designed fundamentally. The Crystal Cave is the first zone that we are discussing that has reused bosses as regular enemies. The area is littered with Moonlight Butterflies that are neutral towards the player in that they do not attack unless attacked first. Asset reuse is a whole topic on its own, but I'll be saving that entire discussion for when we get to Lost Izalith. For, obvious reasons. The Crystal Cave is a tiny area, but it does have a couple of issues. The first has to do with the crystals that the player walks on. They are angled so strangely that sometimes the player will just slide off into the abyss. The evidence for this is on screen. The other criticism I have for this area is about the invisible pathways. All other Lord Soul areas have unique mechanics or gimmicks, but all of them do meaningfully change gameplay to different degrees. This one does not. The hidden pathways are such a non-element as they are signposted by the developers and serve no gameplay function other than being invisible. They're invisible for the sake of it, and because of that, it's a very superficial element of the area. I assume the reason they didn't add any gameplay additions to these walkways is because some kind of item to make them visible would make them too similar to Tomb of the Giants or Lost Izalith, and adding enemies in this area would make this section into the most infuriating one in the game. They're a neat concept, but they lack any meaningful gameplay additions. The only thing they add to the cave is maybe tone and atmosphere, but even then the Crystal Cave doesn't require them to feel like itself. Seath caps off both the Duke's Archives and the Crystal Cave. His gimmick is a crystal at the end of the arena that grants him invulnerability. A player can destroy it with a single attack, and it's a very telegraphed part of the terrain, being lit up like a glow stick. There are two issues with this mechanic that are very nitpicky but also worth mentioning. The first is that it is inert on repeat playthroughs because a player knows about it and it's incredibly easy to get to. You'd think that Seath would have better protection set up for his one weakness. Then again, having a boss fight where they just defend their weak spot is literally what Bed of Chaos is, and I'd rather go hollow than have another Bed of Chaos in this game. The other nitpick probably isn't intended, but Seath can end up accidentally breaking the crystal himself, using his breath attack from as early as the start of the fight. It doesn't ruin the fight because the crystal is such a non-element anyway, but it is bad that it can happen. The fight itself isn't all that great mechanically, nor does it offer anything particularly interesting on the experiential front. He is often a victim of his own size, falling prey to circle-strafing because of how long it takes him to turn to face the player, along with being a camera-eating monstrosity. His mechanics, in a word, are shit. He is not the pinnacle of what Dragon Combat in this game can offer. This is because of his large and crazy tail attacks which have weirdly strong tracking, and Area of Effect Crystal Breath being either the weakest part of his kit, or the strongest on a whim. The only interesting aspect of his gameplay is his tail weapon, the Moonlight Greatsword. Some bosses in Dark Souls 1 have tails that can be cut off by the player to obtain unique weapons that cannot be acquired by any other means. This mechanic also doubles as a way to allow a player to limit a boss's moveset by removing any tail attacks that they may have. This mechanic is a great addition to many fights. It can easily make many fights infinitely more interesting as a player can do more than simply wail at a boss's hitbox for damage, instead needing to deal enough damage to their tail before the boss dies to gain a weapon. This engages players on a level deeper than just wow cool boss, which adds to the boss's quality on an experiential level whether their mechanics are complex or not. This is best exemplified by taking a look, once again, at Bell Gargoyles. The first gargoyle's tail can be cut off, and when the player does, it staggers before looking at the player and roaring. This singular mechanic and animations thereafter add a tremendous degree of character to an otherwise mechanically pretty okay fight, and it deepens the grounded aesthetic of the game once more. This beast acts like a real creature would if someone cut its tail off. It's mechanics like these that show how a simple combat system can be employed and still be worthwhile despite a lack of complexity. This is a mechanic that works as well as it does because of the simple combat. If this existed in a game like Devil May Cry, then it would be very out of place, owing to that game's much more frantic combat system, which rewards fast combos using a variety of the player's toolkit, rather than a deliberate and methodical back and forth. The faster combat becomes, the harder it is to squeeze in mechanics like this such that speed almost necessitates more systemic complexity within combat systems. It's much harder to derive other mechanics from anywhere else in a faster system, as enemies spam attacks and movements all over the player's screen. That discussion shall be shelved until Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3, where there'll be many more references to take advantage of. With the first Lord Soul in our possession, we can move on to the next area, which for the sake of this video shall be the Tomb of the Giants. In reality, a player can acquire any of the Lord Souls in any order. This comes with some obvious pros and cons. The pros relate to player choice and freedom to collect specific items from the routes that interest one the most. For example, I went to the Tomb of the Giants first on my Faith run because it is where the white Titanite chunks I needed to strengthen my Occult Bastard sword were. The cons of this are that all of these areas have to be created with the same level of balance. What this leads to is the first area being the most difficult, and the last area being the easiest, because the player levels up throughout these areas, but the areas are static at a beatable level for any character post Anor Londo. This could have been fixed and made more interesting if each area had unique encounters, depending on how many of the areas the player had been to previously. But again, FromSoft didn't even have the time to finish Lost Izalith. If they had the time, then late game wouldn't have as many flaws as there currently are. Before we arrive at the Tomb of the Giants, we must first complete the Catacombs. The Catacombs suffer from a few issues because of how it sits as both an early and late game area at once. On the early game side, we've already discussed how players can get stuck down there because of the proximity to Firelink Shrine. The reason for this is that most players are generally only ever expected to go down there once the Lord Vessel has been claimed and Warp is unlocked. This means that the method with which the player must use to backtrack is absurdly convoluted and is full of all manner of traps and pitfalls. It suffers on the endgame side because the level was designed so that it can be completed early game, such that the player is monstrously overleveled for it once they have the Lord Vessel, meaning that if one does not know the jump to skip the area, or lacks the max health to survive that jump, then it can be a long and meaningless journey towards the Tomb of the Giants. Not even the boss makes up for the area's issues. Speaking of, what can I even say about Pinwheel? He kinda just dies. Pinwheel suffers from the same issues as the rest of the Catacombs in Microcosm. He is designed so that he can be fought at the start of the game for players to be able to grab the Rite of Kindling early. The issue is how easy the fight is for nearly every player because the vast majority will only fight Pinwheel post Anor Londo. The fight itself is worth discussing in of itself because he can be fought early, so it's worth having the discussion. He is a mage who casts fireballs and can split himself into multiple mirror images that also cast fireballs. Even when fought on even footing, Pinwheel leaves a lot to be desired because of how limited his moveset is and because of how tedious the mirror image move can become. Games that employ mirror image enemies generally have combat systems that allow jumping from target to target decently fast. In a game like Dark Souls, the lack of any movement skill other than the sprinting attack leaves Pinwheel in a pretty rough state, whether he's fought before Anor Londo or not. Enter Tomb of the Giants, and it's dark as fuck. The darkness is this area's gimmick. The player's ability to see is limited by their character's light radius, which can be increased using various items and spells, the most common of which is swapping out the player's equipped offhand to instead be wielding a skull lantern. These lanterns have a chance to be dropped by the necromancers in the catacombs, and there is a guaranteed pickup for one in the area that Patches kicks the player into. The area is littered with giant skeletons, giant dog skeletons, and skeleton pillars known as bone towers. The enemies in the area tend to hit hard and relatively slow, which is probably better than fast, low-damage enemies in such a dark arena, though neither is a particularly fair method of damaging a player with such limited vision. A big part of this zone is taking note of enemy placement to make one's way through. I find running past every enemy until the first bonfire to be the best method of starting out, and it's a crime there's no bonfire after Pinwheel until the player has gotten through about half of the Tomb of the Giants. Pinwheel's boss run back is already one of the more challenging ones because of the wheel skeletons, and forcing this run back for the start of the Tomb of the Giants if a player dies early makes Pinwheel all the more unrewarding. There are very few bosses in Dark Souls 1 that grant access to a bonfire very soon after they are defeated. Not including the 4 Lord Soul bosses and ONS, as those are dead ends anyway, the only ones are Sanctuary Guardian, Artorias of the Abyss, Centipede Demon, Quelaag, and Demon Fire Sage. The rest tend to grant a homeward bone so that a player can warp to their last used bonfire and spend the souls from the boss. Bonfire placement is a topic on its own, but on the whole I think the placement works well for the most part. I would tweak the early game bonfires here and there, but the real issues are within the final 4 zones and even the DLC. Runbacks to bosses and even certain areas seem to grow longer after Anor Londo, and there's no real benefit to this. As I said, consistency and clarity for punishment of death is paramount, and these later game sections seem to increase the time for boss runbacks substantially and for no tangible reason. The darkness gimmick in Tomb of the Giants overall is a neat idea executed in the best way for what Dark Souls can facilitate, but still fails on the mechanical side because Souls combat only works so long as players know what the fuck is going on. It does give the area its own identity and gameplay feel, as playstyle must generally be adjusted to survive, but maybe this concept is slightly misguided. Like the Moonlight Butterfly, this area is attempting to create an experience to be had, but unlike that boss, this area does try to have that experience be mechanical instead of just within its presentation, and that makes it slightly more interesting. I must say that the area would be improved mechanically without losing the experiential aspect if the insta-kill chasms were replaced with walls that act to disorient the player. A dark maze as opposed to a dark death trap. Before Nito, we see many minor pinwheels, and yet again I'm holding back the asset reuse discussion for dear life until we arrive at Demon Fire Sage. Gravelord Nito's fight begins with the player forced to take fall damage unless they have the fall control spell. His arena is donut-shaped with skeletons scattered around. Divine weapons have the unique property of nullifying skeletons' revive ability, so if the player is using anything else, then the fight will be much more challenging, as his skeleton entourage will continue to rebuild themselves throughout the entire duration of the fight. To compensate for that increase in difficulty, Nito himself is quite simple, having very few attacks which are also able to hurt the skeletons around him. He even has a giant AoE ability that can cause the death of every skeleton in the area, so that he can be fought one-on-one until the skeletons rebuild themselves. While these attempts to balance a gank squad boss were made, they aren't exactly airtight, and so the fight remains subpar. Nito himself is uninteresting because every action he takes leaves him in a century-long recovery animation, whereby the player can either just wail on him, or be interrupted by the skeleton gank squad. I would, to some degree, call this fight a dice roll just like Capra Demon, but comparing Nito to that fight is unfair. The most interesting thing about Nito is the Scream attack. This is a long-range attack where Nito plunges his sword into the ground from range, and it comes up at the player character's feet. This attack is always done by Nito at the start of the fight when he is on the other side of the arena from the player. What's interesting is that, because Nito is generally too far away or obscured by other obstacles, the player cannot see him, and thus the telegraph given for this attack is a piercing scream. Having an audio cue as a telegraph isn't uncommon in gaming as a whole, but this is the only audio cue used to telegraph an attack in Dark Souls, and it sets the mood for the fight dramatically well. Dark Souls is a masterclass in setting tone, and we'll get into that in the story section later. Next up, we have the Demon Ruins. After Quelaag's domain and next to the Daughter of the Chaos bonfire is the entrance to the Demon Ruins. This area is your standard lava/hell type area. As expected, the player character takes significant damage from lava at this point, and there's only one pathway to take, leading to Ceaseless Discharge. The area is also currently populated by infested hollows, which can infect the player character with the Egghead disease. That isn't a meme. Your character idle pose will be replaced with an animation of the player character itching their head, and after around 5 minutes, the player's head will be replaced by an egg. This egg steals half of the player's souls and hatches once it has fed 100,000 souls. Hatching it does little more than transform the player's kick into a bite from the creature in the egg. This affliction can be healed with an item that is findable in the Painted World, dropped rarely by certain enemies, and is buyable from Aingi, the afflicted hollow that guards Quelaag's sister. This parasite showcases how you can debuff the player without resulting in the same issues that lie within the curse mechanic. The enemies that the player gets this affliction from are mostly all non-hostile unless provoked, and the effect is easy enough to be rid of that it may as well be opt-in. Is this good though? Well, when there exists a mechanic which is easy to enter into and get out of, there becomes a need for it to do something worthwhile for the player. The parasite is nothing but a debuff, and the bite attack isn't a good trade-off because by then, the player has already sacrificed 100,000 souls, and it's not even that strong in of its own right. If this bite could infect players in PvP, then we would have a winning system that allows players to engage with player versus player combat in a way that goes beyond simply killing the other player. In a word, the mechanic is vapid, despite the sheer amount of potential. Ceaseless Discharge is the only fight in the game that doesn't start as soon as the player walks through the fog door, with the exception of Priscilla, but she counts as non-hostile for other reasons, so doesn't count. The player must pick up the gold hem set found in the arena to start the fight, which is my personal favourite light armor set in the game. It has a great defense to weight ratio and makes me look like a Nazgul. That armor set is the only positive of the fight. Ceaseless Discharge is one of the worst bosses in the game. He has 4 attacks that are all haphazardly put together. First off, his fire beam attack is not dodgeable. It is a ranged attack that he can spam that does a large amount of damage, which necessitates getting close to him, so he stops fucking spamming it. When you're close, 2 of the attacks are just average. He slams his large stringy tendril down, or repeatedly strikes the player, and they allow a few hits on the tendril as his recovery frames last a lifetime. The sweep attack has a huge problem in that it is both a hitbox and a collision box, meaning that if a player successfully dodges it, then they can still potentially get caught on the roll recovery window, because the tendril will nudge the player character, even so far as sometimes pushing them off the ledge. Most attacks that are both hit and collision boxes in this game have this issue. Now, there does exist a mechanic specific for Ceaseless Discharge that puts the pain of fighting him to rest. If the player manages to lead Ceaseless near the fog door, then he will be staggered and insta-killed after a few hits. Yeah, there are many problems with this. First off, leading Ceaseless into this area is the most inconsistent mechanic I've ever tried to use. Sometimes he'll jump straight into this death pit the moment he's in range, whereas other times he just sits by the stairs and spams the undodgeable ranged attack over and over. Secondly, how the fuck is this method in any way intuitive for a player who doesn't look it up? There are no clues, tells, telegraphs to figure this out that it even exists other than online guides or simply getting really lucky. This insta-kill mechanic is not clearly communicated at all. Iron Golem makes sense and exists as an insta-kill which doesn't require the player to do anything other than what they were going to do anyway. It's emergent gameplay, instead of requiring a directed set of actions, which is a stronger experience for the player as it doesn't betray their intuition of how the fight works. Needless to say, the Demon Ruins are not off to a good start. Once Ceaseless is gone, the lava lake shrinks to reveal the path forward. It also reveals many minor Capra and Taurus demons. We'll talk about their reuse in a second. What's more apparent as a discussion right now is pretty obvious. They're just standing there, in unison, menacingly. All jokes aside, this view doesn't look menacing at all. It looks goofy as fuck. It almost looks like someone pressed Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V too many times, and the same can be said for the dragon feet in Lost Izalith. Demon Ruins and Lost Izalith are the biggest offenders of the game being unfinished on release. Enemies are placed in open zones like they're in a Garry's Mod sandbox map. A problem that Dark Souls 1 has to deal with is that no enemies have the autonomy to move around outside of combat with the player. Either by hardware or time limitations, all enemies are static until the player moves into their aggro range. This is what made the Pisakas so unique and interesting previously. This is what leads these areas to look a lot worse and why it looks like someone pressed copy and paste too many times. Artificial is the word I'm looking for, and it describes the Demon Ruins and Lost Izalith perfectly. Both zones look like a level in a video game, instead of looking like a part of a living, breathing world like the rest of the game. That's what immersion and good world and level design are supposed to accomplish, to make the player forget that the world they're in is a creation by developers on a computer, to forget that Lordran is simply a set of assets and enemy models slapped into a game engine. Dark Souls 1 is one of the best examples of this, rivaling some of the most immersive games to ever exist, despite having the limitations that it had. It took a deft hand with ample time to create the splendor of Lordran, and From Software succeeded tremendously with what they had. But this zone shows what can happen when a game's scope outgrows its vision. Whether by ignorance, incompetence, hopefulness, or ambition, the game was slated to be one of the best works of its time, and From got so close to realizing that concept to a masterful degree. In the conclusion to this video, which is now growing closer and closer, I will connect all of these mechanics, ideas, experiences, stories, and flaws that I have discussed over the entire runtime of this video into a definitive statement of the game, which, despite me pointing out many issues with it, does have a happy ending. So begins Demon Firesage. His moveset is identical to the Stray Demon other than a new move here and there, so instead we can finally have that asset reuse discussion. So why do developers reuse assets? Well, it's all about a value for time proposition, a give and a take. Instead of creating 3 uniquely designed models and characters for an Asylum Demon, Stray Demon, and Demon Firesage, they can instead create one and reuse that model in 3 different contexts. That give comes with the take that this is at the risk of breaking immersion, coming across as lazy, presenting too much iterative content, and potentially frustrating players. Asset reuse is everywhere in gaming, and a game can rarely get away with none at all. It is also an extremely nuanced and complex topic, as it relates to player perception and expectations. Players don't mind fighting the same basic enemies over and over, as long as there is enough enemy variety, but that same perception is not shared with bosses because of the expectations as to what experience a boss should offer. Reusing levels and areas is generally seen as okay only so long as enough changes are made to allow a player to perceive it as different enough. There is no place where a definitive line between acceptable and unacceptable lies because of how contextual and subjective the topic is, nor can there ever be one. The only things that we do know are a few general rules of thumb regarding the extremes on both ends, and we can work our way back from those to figure out where the asset reuse in Dark Souls lies in terms of how it affects the final product. Northern Undead Asylum works as a moment of reuse because of one distinct reason: foreshadowing. The Stray Demon and Oscar are foreshadowed at the start of the game. For some players, Oscar will be their introduction to an NPC hollowing. To others, they already know and have experienced what it means to hollow in this world. Having the NPC which saves the player and sets them on their journey hollow and fight them can be a powerful experience and is foreshadowed by the tutorial, because Oscar doesn't die without the player killing him themselves. Oscar alone would be sufficient enough as a reason why asset reuse is fine in this instance, but we should also talk about the Stray Demon. What aids the reuse here is the foreshadowing of the existence of the Stray Demon, but I will say that the reuse of the boss's model is not good asset reuse. The boss health bar and boss music in this game are substantial elements of the game's presentation, and should not be undermined. For an entity to be a boss is a high standard, and asset reuse is an easy way to undercut the experience because it disgraces the boss health bar, and if that happens too often, then the boss health bar won't mean anything anymore. The same criticism comes in with Demon Firesage, and fortunately, the Asylum Demon model is the only one which is reincorporated for boss fights, despite the unfortunate nature of it appearing 3 times. The Moonlight Butterflies in Crystal Cave, minor Pinwheels in Tomb of the Giants, and the minor Taurus Demons and minor Capra Demons in the Demon Ruins do not fall into this same bracket that the subsequent Asylum Demons do, because they are all fought as bosses first, and then reincorporated later, such that the boss fights are not spoiled by any preconceived notion of what those enemies are in relation to the player at that point. They also, except for the pinwheels, are fought a considerable amount of time after their respective boss fights take place, making them slot in with the player character's power progression. They also all, including the pinwheels this time, make sense to be where they are in universe. The pinwheels are the only ones that are slightly off-putting in terms of the time between fighting the boss and basic enemies because of how the boss version is often fought in the endgame. But that's more of a critique of the catacombs and not of their reincorporation as a whole. After the Demon Fire Sage, we have a shortcut up to the Daughter of Chaos Bonfire, and a short path down to the next boss, Centipede Demon. Centipede Demon is one of the more interesting ideas for a fight. His arena is bathed in lava, which does tremendous damage over time to players when they walk on it. Centipede Demon sits in the lava for much of the fight, and throws long-range melee attacks at the player who is standing on the small non-lava part of the entrance to the arena. Once the player has done enough damage to this limb that attacks them from range, it breaks, giving the player the orange charred ring, allowing them to walk on lava. Centipede Demon is one of the two bosses where a ring is required to beat it, and how the player acquires it makes it an interesting mechanic. The Centipede Demon is otherwise not very strong as a boss encounter mechanically, but this small mechanic adds that slight amount of depth to make the fight worthwhile, despite the fight overall being mechanically pretty vapid. This brings us to Lost Izalith, where the orange charred ring is still required. A little bit of a neat detail about this ring is that it grants the kicks added fire damage, because that just makes sense. The game is full of neat secrets and details that add to the value of having knowledge of the game. The player is encouraged to learn more about these mechanics to get the most out of them. That is the sort of feature on a ring which doesn't necessarily need the precise details I was talking about in the handholding section. Speaking of the kick, however, we haven't discussed it yet. When the player taps forward and light attack at the same time, they perform a kick. This kick doesn't do much damage, but it is a consistent stagger to humanoid enemies, which also knocks them back slightly. One of the more interesting uses of it is that it can be used on enemies holding up shields to make them vulnerable to attacks. The mechanic works as intended, but I do have one or two problems with it that are slightly nitpicky. First off, the kick is very easy to do accidentally when trying to move forward and attack at the same time. The issue lies with the lack of buttons on a controller to facilitate it. Every button on the controller does something in Dark Souls, such that jump, roll, and sprint are all bound to circle. The only open button is L3, or pressing down the left stick for you Xbox controller users. While this would work for the kick, I do want to note that I recommend binding jump to L3 instead. On default controls, a player cannot sprint into a roll because that action causes the player to jump, which is an easy way to get oneself killed during combat. Binding jump to L3 removes the circle button from being so overutilized, but also means that, once again, we're out of options for the kick button. As it stands, the controls are less than ideal for this system. It is another instance of working well 99% of the time, but that 1% where it does happen is very noticed. The other issue with the kick is that its implementation is underused. Having a whole player action for kicking is an odd inclusion when it has so few uses. Again, these are small issues, and the kick works just fine for what it was made for. Lost Izalith is very short overall, which is good because of how bad it is. None of the dragon feet need to be fought, and the area is put together with strings and glue. What complex analytical things are there to say about Lost Izalith other than it's not well made in the slightest, because From ran out of time, plain and simply. The only remaining topics to be had here are about mechanics outside of Lost Izalith, which the area is a good catalyst for discussion on. When the player reaches the shortcut, if you can even call it that, players that progress Solaire's questline will have to fight him with the sunlight maggot on his head. I think it's time for the broad NPC discussion. I'm not going to critique the actual writing and storylines of these NPC questlines, because none of them do anything exceptionally well or profound writing-wise, nor do they do anything ridiculous or bad in that regard either. In the story section at the end of the video, the NPC questlines writing will be important though. it'll be interesting to talk about how these storylines connect thematically, to add to the world building and tone of Dark Souls 1. What will be discussed right now is mechanics. One issue across the board for all NPCs is the need to speak to them multiple times until their dialogue is exhausted, and that is not communicated in any way to the player, and that can make them lose access to these NPC chains unknowingly. Intuitive design is at the heart of game design, and where intuition cannot be leveraged, that's when tutorials come in, and Dark Souls 1 does a half and half good job in this regard. Now, to critique further NPC questline mechanics, I'll use Solaire and Siegmeyer as case studies for my points. Siegmeyer is a fan favourite character that starts by following the player's general progression. He goes from Sense Fortress Gate to Sense Fortress to Anor Londo, and then is found back in Firelink Shrine. After that, he fucks off to Blighttown. His dialogue does indicate this, but once down there, his dialogue indicates that he's returning to the surface, but he ends up down in Lost Izalith. Questlines in Dark Souls ought to give some indication of where the NPC is going to be functional in terms of intuitive progression. Siegmeyer has two endings. If he takes a certain amount of damage in the fight in Lost Izalith, then his questline ends here. If he does not or does not join the player in the fight, then he ends up in Ash Lake, killed by his daughter. Solaire's questline works as the standard one which players follow because Solaire simply follows the player's progression without any deviations. He goes from Undead Burg to Undead Parish to Anor Londo to Lost Izalith. The questline ends with Solaire going hollow and attacking the player. The main conclusion on the questline system is that, at the very least, players need some sort of indication where the NPC is going next, even if subtle, in order to be feasible for players to figure out. There's one part of Solaire's questline that I have yet to mention, however. Solaire's questline can have a happy ending if the player makes use of the Daughter of Chaos Covenant, which means that this is a good time to discuss covenants as a whole, and by extension, online features. Covenants come in two distinct types that do have some cross-contamination, them being online and offline. The main difference between these two is the mechanics by which the player progresses in the Covenant. The Daughter of Chaos Covenant levels up by giving humanity, which is acquired through playing PvE, whereas the Warriors of Sunlight Covenant levels up using Sunlight medals, which are most often acquired through co-op. Most Covenants fit into the online group because the Covenant mechanic is often used to facilitate online features unique to Dark Souls, like invasions and summoning. Covenants are essentially factions to be joined that each have their own benefits. Some of these are also tied to certain builds. For example, the Warriors of Sunlight Covenant is required to get lightning spears, which are miracles that require faith to cast. Covenants are a good addition to the game because they add a layer of depth to builds with the benefits that each Covenant can provide. A player cannot switch Covenants without downsides too. The only issue with Covenants is the unfortunate reality that servers will eventually go down, and thus some features that these systems aid to prop up relating to online play will be hamstrung. Getting the second tier of Lightning Spear requires 10 Sunlight medals. Online, that's equivalent to getting summoned 10 times and helping whoever summoned the player to kill a boss. Without online features, the only way to get the second Lightning Spear is to farm Sunlight Maggots, which have a very rare chance to drop Sunlight medals. Without online functionality, Covenants suffer. This is why all in all I'm a big fan of separating online and offline features as much as possible, even if it makes the mechanics themselves slightly less interesting. Game preservation is important. And now for the absolute worst part of Dark Souls 1. It isn't Lost Izalith, it isn't the Anor Londo rafters, no. It's the Bed of Chaos. Bed of Chaos is a massive creature made of fire and wood, stemming from a bug at the center of the creature. A player must break 2 separate weak points in any order, and is then able to kill the bug to end the fight. These weak points do not defend themselves, nor do they have much health. Hell, they get one shot by pretty much everything. The problem is getting anywhere near them, as the bed flails across the screen with both hit and collision boxes. Once one of the weak points has been destroyed, the floor begins to collapse in a few specific locations, which opens up chasms that can insta-kill the player. I'm sure you can understand how having chasms and crazy collision boxes together within a small area can be just a little bit fucked. Once the second weak point is broken, then another chasm opens up right in front of the last weak point, which a player has to do a jump like they're playing a fucking platformer to reach the Chaos Bug. I don't know if you guys knew this, but Dark Souls 1 isn't a platformer. Good platformers have several mechanics built in to make jumping an engaging part of the player's toolkit, as it is generally the main action that a player performs in that genre. Mechanics such as the ability to move in the air, coyote time to allow the jumps to be more forgiving of imperfect timing, and several other game-specific mechanics, like Mario's air spin and the dash in Celeste. The jump in Dark Souls is performed during a sprint and removes all control from the player, as the character jumps a fixed distance every time. Despite this, they decided to create a boss which requires the player to jump onto a flimsy platform while it wails about and shoves the player around. It's bad, is what I'm trying to say, especially with the amount of time the run back takes. This is the one boss that makes me thankful for the game state resetting when quitting and reloading, because quitting out after killing each weak spot makes the fight a whole hell of a lot easier. I can't even confidently chalk this one up to FromSoft running out of time. It's definitely unfinished, but even a finished version of Bed of Chaos would still be broken fundamentally. On to the last Lord Soul. Before we reach New Londo Ruins, we must first take a trip back down into Darkroot Garden to find Sif. Sif can be approached from two directions. A player can either go through Darkroot Garden and Basin to find their way to the boss room, or they can buy the Crest of Artorias from Andre for 20,000 souls to open the shortcut to Sif. The area contains a bunch of player-like enemies of various classes, and mushroom men, but overall the actual zone isn't anything special. It's a large open forest and that's about it. The part of the zone that makes it stand out is the Great Grey Wolf Sif. Sif is a pretty good boss. It is a big doggo with a sword in its mouth that animates exactly like a dog would if it were trying to hit you with a sword in its mouth. Sif's attacks are well telegraphed, and it doesn't have any attacks that are bullshit. The only issue with Sif's mechanics is how weak they are to the player standing under the body. Sif doesn't deal with that well. The true standout of the fight is what happens when Sif is low on HP. Low HP Sif begins to limp and all the attacks from the doggo are slowed down tremendously, with animations to suit the tone of the fight. It's extremely unexpected from the game up to this point, and can be an extremely powerful experience for many players. Sif, in comparison to the other enemies and bosses, is very under-designed visually and for a good reason. Sif just looks like a big dog with a sword in its mouth without any fantasy additions other than the size of the poor creature and the cool sword. The reason why is to pull the player into feeling sorry for it when it's low on life. Its simple design adds to that factor. The grounded aesthetic of the game is fully showcased in this fight, as it has with the Iron Golem and all other previous examples. I would argue that this moment is the crescendo of the grounded aesthetic of the game in such a way that it doesn't get more real than this, despite the player fighting a supernaturally sized animal. The only criticism I have for this is similar to that of Pinwheel. Sif can be fought at any time, and so the boss is balanced for a weaker player than when most fight it. The problem lies with how many players can miss the low HP section of the fight, because they are often able to kill the boss far too quickly to be able to see it. The fix for this is a simple one, and it's just increasing the threshold needed to make Sif limp. Yes, this would make the fight easier overall, but I think that's a good trade-off if they want to make sure that all players see this part of the fight play out in full. With Sif defeated and the ring needed to kill the four kings, we progress into the New Londo Ruins. The area starts with only half of the area able to be traversed as the rest is waterlogged. The area's first half is fighting ghosts on the above area, which can only be damaged if the player uses a transient curse consumable item or is afflicted with the curse status effect. Now would be a great time to discuss consumable items in general before we tackle the area as a whole. Dark Souls gives the player a vast array of consumable items for a large variety of different use cases. Some cure status effects, some are throwable damage items, some give the player passive buffs, some buff the player's weapon, and some grant unique effects. These are found throughout the game as pickups, and some may be bought from the different vendors scattered around Lordran. Consumable items work really well in Dark Souls, because none of them are a hard requirement for beating any given boss or area. The irony of that statement is not lost on me when the item that began this discussion is the only one in the game that is required. Generally, consumable items work well as limited items that amplify the player once used. with them having an inherent opportunity cost built into the fact that they are, consumable. The only problematic one is the transient curse that allows them to damage the ghosts. This is because if a player runs out of them before they've reached the first shortcut, they're forced to either get cursed to kill the enemies or run past them all in hopes that they don't get caught. The funniest part about this is that the vendor that sells them only appears when you're a few seconds from being done with the ghost section. New Londo is a pretty good level in terms of how it comes together, but not when we add the ghosts into the mix. The ghosts are the most unfair enemies in the game, which is unique for Dark Souls because yes, it's hard, but it's generally also very fair. The ghosts phase through walls, follow the player until eternity once they're aggroed, and all their attacks go through walls too, and that includes their grab attack. Yes, you heard that correctly. Ghosts have a grab attack that can be used on the player through fucking walls. This is all bad enough without the need for transient curses to defeat them. With the transient curse requirement, it causes a lot of players to run through New Londo ruins instead of taking the time and playing the area as it was intended. Once the water has been drained out of the area, the bottom half opens up, and the primary enemies down there are the Dark Wraiths, which are much more fair enemies in comparison to the ghosts. This also opens up the way to the Four Kings, which is the only Lord Soul boss that can be fought before acquiring the Lord Vessel. The Four Kings, similar to Centipede Demon, require a ring to fight them. They are within the Abyss, a black void of nothingness except the player and the boss. This area, removing a player of their depth perception, makes the fight already one of the more interesting ones in the game. The boss is not technically a multi-enemy boss fight in the standard sense, as their name would suggest. One king spawns at a rate of about 1 per 40 seconds. They all have a joint health bar while also having a health bar connected to each king. What this leads to is 4 kings essentially being a DPS check. It's a test to see if a player can defeat each king before another spawns. This is one of the few fights in Dark Souls that rewards aggressive play over the usual defensive playstyle that Dark Souls champions. Each of the kings is identical in their mechanics, and they're overall pretty well designed. The only issue with them is the ranged attack that homes onto the player for a while. It does disappear after a time, but the only way to deal with it without blocking or tanking it is to focus on it, which will generally give another king enough time to spawn. Unavoidable damage is very few and far between in Dark Souls. The only existence of it that we have discussed prior to this point is the fall damage to enter Nito's arena, Stray Demon's arena, and the mandated death to Seath. Unavoidable damage should be steered clear from at all costs in Dark Souls, because it betrays a player's understanding of their current resources regarding their healing capabilities, which is a large part of the decision making that the game offers. Overall, the Four Kings is a thumbs up in terms of design, despite their couple flaws. Now we have all of the Lord Souls. It is time to begin the DLC before we go to the Kiln of the First Flame. The first part of this is to unlock access to the DLC, which is the worst part of all of it. I shall list the requirements in order, and then we'll discuss them. One must first kill the Hydra down in Darkroot Basin, a monster with many problems of its own. It has collision box issues similar to Bed of Chaos, and its final head is a chore to kill because of how it can often land too far away from when a player can reach it, forcing many players to use ranged attacks, even if they don't have any in their arsenal. They must then reload the game or die. After that, they can go to the cove and find a golden golem with an NPC inside, and talk to her once it's been killed. They must then go to Duke's archives and kill this random crystal golem just sitting there. They can then go back to the basin to enter the DLC through a portal where the golden golem spawned initially. So, how the fuck is any player supposed to naturally come across this? The existence of Google does not mean that a game should have obfuscated design and get a free pass. I don't care if it's Dark Souls or Candy Crush, games should not be so obtuse that a player must Google how to do something because of how bizarre it's designed. In what world is this an intuitive method of accessing the DLC content? A good way to improve this would be to have a starting point that people can figure out the path forward from there. Dusk sort of acts like this when she is freed from the golem. The issue from that point is that there is no indication that the player must then go to the Duke's archives. I would bet everything that the vast majority of players who didn't look it up but still managed to get to the DLC did it entirely by accident. I'm sure the mystery was fun for the first 24 hours back in 2012 when this DLC came out, but it has aged like milk. The DLC opens with a great fight against the Sanctuary Guardian. Its design is that of your standard Manticore, and it has a great many attacks. I've already pointed out its silly magic resistance, but other than that, the fight is pretty great. A player can tell how many swipes and headbutts the creature will do if they pay attention to his moves and telegraphs, rewarding mastery over the fight. The creature has many ways to punish players that make mistakes, with the Wind Gust attack and Tail Sweep that poisons. This is the best designed boss since Ornstein and Smough from a mechanical standpoint, and we will continue to see this design philosophy continue to develop as we progress in the DLC. What design philosophy specifically? Well, we'll get to it after Manus. Next up is the Royal Wood, which was the Darkroot Garden in the past. FromSoft likes using their DLC content for time travel shenanigans. The area as a whole isn't that special and is just a prelude to the best boss in the game, Artorias of the Abyss. Before we start this section, I just want to get one criticism of the fight out of the way, which is the long run back. The run back isn't the worst in the game, but it is quite the journey in comparison to the Sanctuary Guardian. The problem there's been with critiquing run-back times in Dark Souls 1 is how utterly inconsistent they are. What I will say regarding run-back times is that once you give players a fast-as-fuck run-back, it's very difficult to give them a longer one after that point. For a lot of players, it'll feel longer than it actually is if a precedent has been set previously of how short they can be made. So, how do I even begin to compliment Artorias? The story and visual presentation aspects of him will have to wait until the story section. All I'll say right now is he is a masterclass in visual presentation. Right now we can get down to the grips with his amazing mechanics. For starters, the hitboxes are tight, the attacks are well telegraphed with different timings, and his moveset is quite modular compared to the rest of the bosses in Dark Souls 1. By that I'm talking about how he can put his moves together in a lot of different ways. All those things would already make him a great boss, but he has a few extra mechanics and features that elevate him above the rest by a substantial margin. The first one is one that most players will engage with and recognize: his ability to power himself up if left alone to do so. This move means that players must always be mindful to stay in the flow of the fight. Backing away too much, healing when you're not supposed to, and overall not paying too much attention will very much allow him to complete his power-up. The time it takes for him to achieve it, on the other hand, also allows players who are reading the telegraphs to get an edge, as he's vulnerable to damage in this stance without any way of retaliating until the power-up is either complete or interrupted. This then doubles as moments for players' decision making. If a player is really low and would rather heal than achieve some extra damage, they have more than enough time to do so, but at the cost of allowing Artorias to gain the upper hand for a short while. The next mechanic is the Spinning Slash. This move is unique in that it must be dodged backwards to evade both hits. This is a great way to increase the challenge using mechanics that already exist in a way that can feel completely natural instead of artificial. If the Capra Demon's dogs are on one end of the scale, showcasing one of the worst examples of artificial increases in difficulty, Artorias' Spinning Slash is on the other end. I also want to give an honorable mention here to the fucking brilliant subtle animation similarities between Sif and Artorias. The Spinning Slash is the perfect example. The last mechanic may be a controversial one, but it's part of the fight and ought to be discussed. That is the front flip's ability to ignore iframes. Now, depriving a player of mechanics that they're used to can be a powerful experience, and isn't prescriptively bad in that of itself. What this iframe ignoring attack allows for is an attack that a player must be hyper aware of. If it is not dodged, it can hit a player multiple times even if they're on the ground. What it does to not become unfair with this added factor is its weak tracking. I haven't needed to discuss tracking thus far, so for the unaware, tracking simply refers to how long an attack follows the player until it hits. Artorias' front flip follows the player as long as they're within a small cone in front of him. The flip will not rotate Artorias more than about 70 degrees. All of these added mechanics, plus the already fantastic telegraphing and presentation, make Artorias the best boss in the entire game. After Artorias is the DLC area proper, Oolacile Township and the Chasm of the Abyss. The areas are overall incredibly linear zones that have a clear beginning and end, because the DLC area would have to be much bigger in order to be interconnected like the rest of Lordran. This isn't a flaw, by the way. There are benefits to having disconnected levels like this DLC and the Painted World, in addition to the interconnected world of Lordran. It facilitates an ability to break free of Lordran's very grounded network of areas, as long as these disconnected levels can be contextualized correctly, and fortunately, they are. The township also uses its space to good effect, by having hidden rooms, secrets to find, optional enemies to fight, and a steady progression of the difficulty in enemy encounters. It is done in a simple yet effective way. The normal enemies of this zone gain glowing red eyes once the harder variations begin to emerge. Before we move on to the Chasm of the Abyss, let's first discuss the optional boss of the DLC, Black Dragon Kalameet. A normal looking dragon boss was to be expected when the creatures were set up in the intro. Kalameet is a great dragon fight all around. Once again, it is a fight with good telegraphing and fair attacks that reward careful attention to his moves. I hope you're starting to sense a pattern with this DLC. Just like the Sanctuary Guardian and just like Artorias, the aim of this fight is to go in, learn the moveset, dodge and punish at the right times. There was a lack of these sort of fights in the base game, so them being stuffed into the DLC doesn't hurt anybody. We'll get back to this point after Manus, but I just wanted to note it now. The most interesting thing about Kalameet outside of his great mechanics is his drop after the fight. The player gains a ring that can be worn to make the game harder. Many games have different ways of incorporating player-defined difficulty, and Dark Souls is one of the best examples of this, and is exemplified by this ring. It has a negative effect attached and takes up a ring slot, making it doubly as effective as a challenge item. And now we move to the Chasm of the Abyss. This area is a massive prelude to Manus. The enemies here are humanities, yes, the same ones we've been using to level up covenants and heal. Humanity is a very important resource in Dark Souls. It is used to level up covenants, kindle bonfires, become human, and also acts as a full 0 to 100 heal. It can be used to regain the last gasp of health needed to triumph over a difficult boss, or push through a tough area. It slots into the healing system well because of how limited the supply is early into the game before the Chasm of the Abyss, where it can first be optimally farmed. Rats drop it in Undead Parish, and I feel sorry for anyone who decided to farm them for it. The balance is just about right with humanity because of the different uses for it, such that it does not become overpowered on the healing front, especially seeing as players lose humanity in the same way as their souls. Speaking of the enemy humanities though, they are a great way of recontextualizing this helpful resource as an enemy in how they look and how they deal damage. They don't have attacks, they just float towards the player and are a damaging hitbox when they're touched. Sif is in this area, by the way, as a puppy. He's cute. And now, Manus, Father of the Abyss. His attacks are well telegraphed, he leaves himself decently open after some of his bigger hits, and has reasonable tracking. That is until his second phase, where he gains magical attacks that can be a little bit unfair because of just how much damage they can end up doing. Overall, Manus is pretty good from a mechanical standpoint. These are now statements you've heard me say ad nauseum about the Artorias of the Abyss DLC. All of the bosses in this DLC are mechanically great fights. You go in, learn the moves, dodge, punish, and repeat for every boss, and I don't want to denigrate that type of gameplay. That is what Artorias is at his core, and he is the best boss in the entire game because of how well designed it is. But the issue that comes when every boss is designed to be this mechanically focused is that they lose their value if they don't at least rival the best of this type of boss. The response to this point will generally be that the quality of the lesser fight is at fault, and not bosses meant to test mechanical prowess as a whole. All of the bosses I will pick from the following examples are ones I believe to be of quality with respect to their own design goals. Let's first take Sanctuary Guardian and Artorias as examples. Is it the fault of Sanctuary Guardian that it does not reach the level of quality of Artorias? Let me grant you the answer is yes. If Sanctuary Guardian and Artorias were on the same level, then it would be no issue. Now let's take Artorias and Quelaag as examples. Is it a problem that Quelaag is less mechanically sound than Artorias? No. The whole experience of her fight is how she uses her area denial to augment her simple attacks, to alter the player's strategy in an engagement with her. She could have been made to be more mechanically rigorous, but then she'd risk losing her core mechanical identity. They are not comparable. So, we've established that this issue only affects two bosses with similar design goals. Now let's take Iron Golem and Great Grey Wolf Sif. When we compare the two, Sif is the better boss mechanically, but does that take away from what Iron Golem is? Also no. They are both bosses made to provide a certain non-mechanical experience, and the one cannot retroactively take away from the other what they were each going for. This is because they are trying to create more subjective experiences that cannot be reasonably measured in their effectiveness. So with that, we can reasonably state that this is an issue unique to bosses made to be mechanical marvels. And so is the solution just to chastise Sanctuary Guardian for not being as good as Artorias? Perhaps it is. But then I wonder if FromSoft's ambition is misplaced in attempting to have a vast multitude of these types of fights to begin with, unless they can be sure to knock it out of the park every time. This is a problem unique to the Souls genre. Games with better action combat can get away with worse enemies from time to time because the player combat of those games derives so much value to the experience. Hell, just look at ARPGs, which get praised for having player characters that can cleave through multiple screens worth of enemies in mere seconds. Because of the simple combat of Dark Souls 1, gameplay relies heavily on the mechanical design of enemies, as they are where the mechanical depth lies, which other action games don't have to worry about as much. Just to make sure everyone understands, this is not an argument to shield bosses with genuine flaws from criticism, nor is it bad for From to ambitiously create multiple bosses which mechanically test the player's skill. It's just a thought that this does create an unfortunate pitfall for bosses that are good to be reduced in value for the simple reason that they do not reach the top of the S tier. But hey, stick around for the next lot of videos because from Bloodborne onwards, this topic is going to come up a lot more. On to the final area, Kiln of the First Flame. This is less of an area than it is just a lead up to Gwyn. The area is filled with Black Knights, now just as basic enemies instead of them being mini-bosses. There isn't much to write home about here because this area doubles as the run back to Gwyn, seeing as the Lord Vessel remains the only bonfire for him. The final fight begins when the player walks through the fog door. I'll let this fight play out and I'll say stop when we find something to talk about. Okay, stop. We need to discuss the game's soundtrack. Action games generally have a style of music that serves to hype up the player during moment-to-moment gameplay. Virgil's theme in Devil May Cry 5 is the best example of this.
I am the storm that is approaching.
Other examples include, but are not limited to, the soundtrack of the rest of Devil May Cry 5, Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, Path of Exile, Hades, and Dead Cells. These soundtracks tend to remain as such until their final or otherwise pinnacle bosses. Now let's take a look at Gwyn and hear what this game is going for. You've been hearing it throughout this whole video. And for those of you who are watching this whole thing without ever touching Dark Souls 1, yes, this is the final boss's theme. Now let's rewind for a second and we'll get back to Gwyn shortly. The soundtrack's biggest sticking point is its willingness to be subtle, soft, and quiet. The game does not have ambient music. The only places where music is played are in boss fights and Firelink Shrine. Other than that, the game's audio is entirely diegetic. This allows boss fights to increase in gravitas because music adds layers to their presentation, and this is why the game's willingness to be soft with some of it can be extremely powerful. Contrast within the soundtrack is one of its strengths. Ornstein and Smough is a bombastic orchestral sweep of brass, choir, and hard-hitting drums. Whereas Seath utilizes a much more somber atmosphere in the choir and sheer lack of any bombast. Even having sections of solo violin and what sounds like some kind of harpsichord or acoustic guitar. I said this in my ReZero video, but I'll say it again. I can't go too in depth with each specific song because composition and melody are not my strong suit. Percussion is my home for the time being. If you do want to watch some actually valuable reaction content with some real analysis on the music of Dark Souls in a way that's made easy to understand for everyone, go watch Davi Vask. I highly recommend his videos. The takeaway from the soundtrack of Dark Souls is that it understands when to be quiet and when to be loud, such that it can be more powerful than if it were just bombast for every track, especially seeing as some of the aspects of the world and characters of Dark Souls would make bombast for them specifically super inappropriate. Massive orchestral scores for Seath, Gwyn, or Artorias would be kinda rude. Now, onto Gwyn proper. He's a great fight, showcasing that certain mechanics that are usually cheap and unfair can be incorporated to improve gameplay rather than hinder it if done well. I'm, of course, talking about his ability to input read the player's heal. He is often cited as the boss in Dark Souls that doesn't allow the player to heal, and it works because this mechanic has been pretty much absent up to this point. There is not a 100% guarantee that he will use this heal punish either. If Gwyn was a boss fight filled with other issues, such as wonky hitboxes or inconsistent tracking, then this input read would be mighty unfair, but because he is a treat to fight in all other mechanical aspects, he gets away with it. Now there's been one key part of the Gwyn fight I've overlooked thus far, and it's finally time to discuss the last main mechanic that I have yet to talk about. The parry system. If a player is holding a shield or the parrying dagger, they can perform a parry by pressing the L2 or left trigger. Timed correctly, and the enemy which was parried is now vulnerable to a critical hit, in the same way that a backstab is a critical hit. This is often referred to as a riposte. The player is invulnerable during the riposte, just like in a backstab, and the enemy falls onto the ground in the same manner too. There are a few issues with the parry riposte as a system, one of which is only applicable to boss fights, and the other is an issue across the board. The issue with the parry that persists throughout the entire game is the timing. To time a parry, the player must press the button just before they get hit with an attack. The problem with this is that the timing is identical to that of the roll, meaning that choosing to parry instead of rolling tests the exact same skill, but one is ridiculously more powerful than the other. Parrying is the pinnacle of what risk-reward should be at its core, but because of this similarity in timing, it makes it on the same level as rolling for the risk, but increases the reward substantially. The easy fix for this is changing the parry timings to be slightly different, but that can lead to the issue of a lack of intuitive design. It is intuitive that a parry ought to be used as an attack is about to hit the player, and bringing that window further back in the enemy's attack animation needs to be contextualized and easy to understand. The issue with parries in the context of boss fights is an issue locked to Gwyn. because he is the only parryable boss. Miyazaki said in an interview that this was a mistake in hindsight. He wanted Gwyn to be a full test of a player's skill and so allowed the player's entire toolkit to be used. He never expected the ability to parry Gwyn to turn him into a joke. By happenstance, this does add to Gwyn's strengths narratively, but mechanically it's still poor. The issue with parrying bosses is that it takes any flow out of the fight. The player parries the boss to the ground, they get back up, get parried to the ground again, and repeat, instead of players learning multiple timings, combos, and strategies for a boss's moveset. They learn the timing of the opening strikes and use that same timing over and over to trivialize the encounter. It is piss poor design that Gwyn can be ruined with parries like this, and the only saving grace is the narrative implications. How is this fixed? Unfortunately, we need more references before I can make any conclusions on this, and those references will only be available to me once Elden Ring is covered. We have all of Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 to get through before I can make my case. That is Dark Souls 1 covered completely in its mechanics. So now we have one last major topic. The game's opening cutscene details how the world came to be. It is the creation myth of the world of Lordran. Gwyn and the other lords found souls within the first flame, and began the Age of Fire after winning against the ancient stone dragons. Now several hundred or thousand years later, the fire is fading, and we as undead have been branded with the dark sign, a mark that causes us to keep on coming back after death until we have no humanity left and eventually go hollow. For the sake of this video, I will not be fully critiquing all of the lore of Dark Souls. I will reference the lore as it pertains to the story, but the deepest of lore is of little importance to this analysis. Also, yes, you heard me. Dark Souls is unfairly maligned as a game without a story, focusing entirely on gameplay and lore, but this is simply untrue. Dark Souls has a story, although simple, and it's worth discussing. The story of Dark Souls gives the player all of the reasons why all of the events happen. We have a clear goal as presented by the story, and so all the player's actions can be contextualized around that umbrella. For example, why is the player going to Blighttown? The answer? To ring the second bell of awakening, as asked of us by Oscar. There is no confusion on why we are doing what we are doing as long as the player pays attention. This is very important for many players, and it's great that it's included in the narrative. So here's the basic rundown of events. Oscar saves us from the Undead Asylum because of his family's prophecy. In his dying breath, he tells us to ring the Bell of Awakening, and the player's character does so to honor the death of the man who saved us from the asylum. We learn from the crestfallen warrior that there are two bells, one above and one below. Once the bells have been rung, the gate to Sen's fortress is opened, and Frampt tells us our destiny, to acquire the Lord Vessel and usurp Lord Gwyn to link the fire. Guinevere also pushes us to this goal of fulfilling prophecy and linking the fire. We follow through with it and kill Gwyn, sacrificing our life to restart the Age of Fire by linking the first flame. Very simple stuff. The door is then opened on these events and the nature of them if the player finds the other serpent, Karth. There is then the idea that there is no prophecy. The chosen undead isn't real, but is instead serving the aims of the other characters in the world to push us to relink the fire for their own ends. We also can choose to not link the fire, to instead leave the kiln, and by doing so, allowed the world to come to one of darkness, and use our power to reign as the Lord of Dark. There are players that see the two endings of Dark Souls 1, prolonging the Age of Fire and ushering in a world of dark, as the good and bad endings of the game respectively. This is an unfortunately shallow view of the story of this world. I can easily see arguments being made for both endings. Linking the fire has an aspect of hope to it. Maybe someday there will be a way of having an everlasting Age of Fire that all can bask in. The curse of the undead began because of the fading flame and Gwyn's sacrifice. Allowing the curse to continue in a world of dark is a definite and possibly cruel fate that ought be avoided. Ushering in the world of dark is more about coming to terms with the idea that all things come to an end, and holding on to a thing for longer than it should be is exactly how Gwyn ended up in the state that he's in by the time that the player finds him. The fire will eventually fade, and prolonging the Age of Fire does little more than delay the inevitable. The World of Dark will happen eventually, it's just a matter of time. It's up to you as a player to decide if whether linking the fire is worth it once you realize the nature of the dwindling flame. There are no right or wrong answers here. It's completely up to your own judgment of which future is best for this world. The entire story is simple to grasp whether the player finds these extra tidbits from Karth or not, and doesn't deserve that much praise for the story it has decided to tell, as it's not all that complex or well structured. Instead, what the story gains from all these events, coupled with the lore behind them, is the themes. What the story meant for each player is their prerogative, but the story does a good job of showcasing these themes and what it means for this world in a way that anyone can come up with an interpretation or reading of the events. The method of storytelling is one of the reasons for this. Ambiguity is all over the place. There is little to no aspect of the lore or story of Dark Souls which is clear-cut. This has its strengths and weaknesses, but it is using the medium of video games in a way unique to this art form. The only part of the world which is not ambiguous is the tone. The world is bleak and full of tragedy around every corner. NPC quests often end in their tragic demise or going hollow, a fate that leads them to forego their humanity and attack the player because they have no reason left to live. Solaire was at a loss in his search for the sun, and once he was overtaken by a sunlight maggot, his reason to carry on was forfeit. Siegmeyer went on an adventure and was killed by his daughter, after his last adventure's end caused him to go hollow. Gwyn spent the last of his power on keeping the flame lit for as long as he could, until he couldn't sustain the flame anymore and went hollow trying to keep the kingdom he built from falling apart. Artorias was meant to succeed in the fight with the Abyss, but it overtook him, and so we are forced to put him down and finish the quest in his name, gaining no renown from our actions and allowing the world to believe that Artorias was a hero that gave his life to win against the Abyss. All of this emotionally impacted me, but I can see why some players may have differing opinions on this. The tragic characters and stories within Dark Souls have no tangible writing element that makes most of these powerful. It is simply the idea of the tragedies that cause the reaction from the audience because of the amount of ambiguity. A lot of discussions around the tragedies of Dark Souls frame the writing as profound, despite the references to such being simply the dark themes. Dark Souls doesn't do anything profound or inspired. It is simply really good at presenting tragic ideas in a way that allows for a lot of discussion bred from ambiguity. The takeaway from all of this is that Dark Souls is one of the best examples of tone within world building, gameplay, and storytelling within the context of video games, but shouldn't be seen as infallible or necessarily complex. It's good, it's not great, but it is good. In conclusion, Dark Souls 1 is a great game with a lot of mechanics working together to create a grounded and a meaningful experience for a first playthrough, with many different builds and options for players to enjoy both in subsequent playthroughs and in New Game Plus. The controls are tight, despite having some issues here and there with the camera and cardinal rolling. The simple action gameplay is improved by other mechanical systems that heighten that gameplay. These include the stamina system, the build diversity, the enemy variety, status effects, covenants, level design, animation commitment, and enemy resistances being such that players' choice of damage type cannot break immersion. The world comes together in ways that can leave the player in awe as they travel between zones connected by all manner of shortcuts and intermittent areas. The second half of the game post Lord Vessel is a step down in quality, but the core gameplay and grounded aesthetic do not take a hit outside of the unfinished Lost Izalith. Players have a large degree of choice in build variety, the game hosting vast quantities of weapons and leveling options. The bosses come in all shapes and sizes, and allow for many experiences unique to Dark Souls, by using bosses as a way to generate different experiences for the player, whether that's by visual design or mechanical design, despite having a few bosses that miss the mark scattered around. All of this comes together in a package that allows Dark Souls to be very unique with how it sits among the general gaming landscape, such that I cannot describe it in any way other than a masterpiece. It is a masterpiece with flaws, but a masterpiece nonetheless. It is attempting to be more than just a difficult action game through its gameplay, tone, and auxiliary features, such as its soundtrack and lore. After the release of my Resident Evil 4 remake video, I have had many discussions about number ratings for media, such that I'm not going to give Dark Souls a number rating. You can come to your own number rating if you want, based on your experiences and the flaws and praises that I have pointed out throughout this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Next up is Bloodborne. I may release videos in between that are not these Soul videos, as they take a long time to make, but this series will be complete eventually. I will not let it go unfinished. Oh yeah, and just a quick side note, please do not watch the original Elden Ring video on my channel. I made it very early on in this channel's lifespan, and I do not see it as up to my new standard of video making. If you want to help me be able to release these videos faster, then please support me on Patreon. You can do so from as little as £1 a month. If you cannot support me through that avenue and you still want to show me support, then please consider liking and subscribing, as that does help. I can't wait to get through all of these games in this format with you. Thank you once again. Goodbye.